the sea can feel empty right up until the moment it isn't. In October of 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal were no longer just stretches of ocean on a chart. They were contested arteries feeding a campaign that neither side could afford to abandon. Henderson Field, carved into coral and dust, had become the center of gravity. Whoever kept it, supplied could hold the island. Whoever neutralized it could tip the balance across the entire South Pacific. Every convoy, every bombardment force, every night movement at sea was part of a larger, tightening struggle. Cape Esperance was not a grand fleet action planned months in advance. It was an interception. Japanese forces continued to run reinforcements and supplies down what Americans called the Tokyo Express, using destroyers under cover of darkness to avoid air attack. Or alongside those runs came bombardment missions designed to silence Henderson Field long enough for transports to unload. The pattern was clear. The danger was immediate. The response had to be calculated. For the United States Navy, this meant testing something still new: radar-guided night fighting. Earlier clashes around the Solomons had exposed painful weaknesses. Ships had collided in confusion. Gunfire had erupted at close range without clear identification. Japanese night tactics, particularly torpedo employment, had proven deadly. Lessons had been learned, but learning under fire is never complete. On the night of the engagement, American cruisers and destroyers maneuvered north of Guadalcanal, guided by radar contacts rather than visual confirmation. The tension was not theatrical. It was technical and human at the same time. Officers staring at scopes, plotting movement across dark water, making decisions on partial information. Contact came as blips first, then shapes, then muzzle flashes tearing through darkness. American ships opened fire with the advantage of initial detection. Shells landed with accuracy that surprised even those who trusted the new technology. Japanese cruisers were struck early and hard. One vessel, caught unprepared for the direction of the attack, absorbed devastating damage. But no night battle remains clean. Signals were misinterpreted. Some American ships ceased fire prematurely. Japanese torpedoes streaked invisibly beneath the surface. And though the American force avoided catastrophic losses that night, the danger never disappeared. Or in the confusion of overlapping formations and shifting bearings, clarity dissolved almost as quickly as it formed. The Battle of Cape Esperance did not end the struggle for Guadalcanal. It did not eliminate Japanese night operations entirely. What it did was interrupt the rhythm. It demonstrated that radar, when coordinated effectively, could disrupt Japanese superiority in nocturnal engagements. It imposed losses at a moment when attrition mattered deeply. It gave American crews a measure of confidence that had been fragile after earlier reverses. Yet even in victory, the limitations were visible. Japanese destroyers still delivered reinforcements. Bombardments continued in subsequent nights. The campaign remained contested. Cape Esperance was not decisive in isolation. It was part of a sequence, a tightening contest, where each engagement layered pressure upon pressure. It showed adaptation in progress. It showed how quickly technology could alter tactics when integrated with discipline and training. For the sailors involved, the battle was less about doctrinal evolution and more about survival. The darkness was total. The sea reflected firelight and fractured patterns. Orders had to be shouted over thunderous gunfire. Damage control teams prepared for impacts that might or might not come. The history of the Battle of Cape Esperance is not a tale of overwhelming triumph. It is a study in incremental change, in how a navy bruised by early night defeats recalibrated, in how radar shifted perception, in how confidence grows not from certainty, but from tested adaptation. Guadalcanal would continue to consume ships and men for months after. But at Cape Esperance, the balance of night fighting tilted, not completely, not permanently, but perceptibly. This is the story of the Battle of Cape Esperance, an engagement fought in darkness where technology met experience, where lessons were applied under pressure, and where the Pacific War edged closer to a new equilibrium. Before you continue, take a quiet second and notice your own surroundings. Is the room still, or does it carry the low hum of life beyond your focus? Are you at the start of something today, or winding it down? Let yourself register the time without looking at a clock. Cape Esperance unfolded in darkness, broken only by sudden light. Let this story unfold in whatever light you're in right now. The waters surrounding Savo Island on the morning of October 10th, 1942, held a secret that would haunt the United States Navy for decades to come. Beneath the dark blue surface, at depths ranging from 200 to 600 feet, lay the twisted wreckage of 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Astoria, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra. They had gone down just 2 months earlier, on August 9th, in a battle that lasted barely 32 minutes. The seafloor had become a graveyard, and sailors in the fleet had already begun calling these waters by a name that would stick: Iron Bottom Sound. It was a tribute to the men who died there, and a warning to those who would follow. The Battle of Savo Island had been a catastrophe of a magnitude the American Navy had rarely experienced. And Japanese forces under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had approached in darkness, exploiting superior night fighting tactics and optical equipment that American commanders hadn't even known existed. When dawn broke on August 10th, over 1,000 Allied sailors were dead, their ships torn apart by Type 93 torpedoes and 8-inch gunfire. The American and Australian forces had been caught completely unprepared, their radar primitive or misinterpreted, their formations scattered, their communication systems inadequate for the chaos of night combat. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a revelation of how unprepared the Allied navies were for the kind of warfare the Japanese had perfected. In the weeks that followed Savo Island, the pattern repeated itself with brutal consistency. Japanese destroyers and cruisers ran what they called the Rat Run, and what Americans bitterly termed the Tokyo Express, high-speed nighttime supply missions down the slot, the 675-kilometer waterway that threaded through the Solomon Islands. These ships would arrive after dark, unload troops and supplies for the garrison on Guadalcanal, and depart before dawn brought American air superiority. American surface forces, traumatized by Savo Island and lacking confidence in night operations, largely avoided confrontation. The few times they tried to intercept, Japanese forces seemed to vanish like ghosts, only to reappear at point-blank range with devastating torpedo spreads already in the water. By early October, 22 Tokyo Express runs had been completed with minimal Japanese losses, and the psychological impact on American commanders was profound and corrosive. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, commanding South Pacific forces from his headquarters in Noumea, New Caledonia, pored over casualty reports and intelligence summaries with mounting desperation. His radio traffic to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor grew increasingly pessimistic, warning that American forces might not be able to hold Guadalcanal against determined Japanese reinforcement. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Every night the Tokyo Express ran successfully brought more Japanese soldiers, more artillery, more supplies to threaten Henderson Field, the crucial airstrip that American Marines had captured in August. If Henderson Field fell, the entire Guadalcanal operation would collapse, and with it, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. The technological disparity between the two navies was stark and humiliating. Japanese optical equipment, refined through years of night combat training, allowed lookouts to spot enemy ships at ranges where Americans saw nothing but darkness. The Type 93 Torpedo, which Allied intelligence hadn't even known existed until after Savo Island, had a range of 40 kilometers compared to the 5.5-kilometer range of American torpedoes. It ran on pure oxygen, leaving almost no visible wake, and carried a warhead weighing over 500 kilograms. Japanese cruisers and destroyers were designed from the keel up for night surface action, with crews drilled endlessly in quick target acquisition, rapid maneuvering, and coordinated torpedo attacks. American ships, by contrast, were built primarily for daytime gunnery duels, and most commanders had virtually no training in night combat beyond theoretical classroom exercises. Aboard ships of the South Pacific Force, morale reflected this grim reality. Radar operators aboard USS Helena, one of the few American cruisers equipped with the new SG surface search radar, described the psychological terror of tracking contacts in darkness, while knowing that Japanese forces could see them first. A sailor later recalled the constant fear that gripped crews during night patrols near Guadalcanal, the knowledge that at any moment, long-lance torpedoes might be racing toward them through the black water, invisible and unstoppable. Officers who had survived Savo Island spoke in hushed tones about the speed with which Japanese gunfire had found its targets, the accuracy that seemed impossible in total darkness. Oh, the disciplined ferocity of an enemy that owned the night. Yet there were glimmers of possibility amid the despair. The SG surface search radar, installed on Helena and a handful of other ships, represented a potential technological equalizer. Operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength with 360-degree scanning capability, it could detect surface ships at ranges up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. This was revolutionary, the ability to know where enemy ships were before they could see you. But in October 1942, the technology was so new that most officers didn't trust it, and the men who operated the equipment had only months of experience. Navy doctrine had no established procedures for integrating radar information into tactical decisions. The potential was there, and waiting to be unlocked by commanders willing to bet their ships on an unproven technology. By October 9th, Allied intelligence had intercepted and partially decoded Japanese naval communications, indicating another major Tokyo Express run, scheduled for October 11th. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, working with the partially broken JN-25 naval code, determined that Japanese forces would include multiple cruisers and destroyers escorting seaplane tenders loaded with troops and artillery. The intelligence was solid enough that Admiral Gormley authorized an intercept operation, assigning the mission to Rear Admiral Norman Scott and Task Force 64. For Scott, it represented an opportunity that previous American commanders hadn't possessed. Advance warning of Japanese movements, time to plan, time to position his forces for an ambush rather than stumbling into a meeting engagement. The question was whether knowledge alone could overcome the tactical superiority Japan had demonstrated so devastatingly. Scott's task force departed Espiritu Santo on October 10th, moving north toward the waters that had claimed so many American lives. The force consisted of heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City, light cruisers Boise and Helena, and 5 destroyers, Fahrenholt, Duncan, Laffey, Buchanan, and McCullough. It was a powerful formation on paper, but the men aboard these ships knew they were sailing toward the same waters where Quincy, Astoria, Vincennes, and Canberra had died. They were heading back to Iron Bottom Sound, where the wrecks of their sister ships lay in the darkness below, and where Japanese forces had proven themselves masters of night combat. The iron at the bottom was a reminder of failure, but it was also a challenge, a debt owed to the men who had died there, a test of whether the American Navy had learned anything from catastrophe. As Task Force 64 steamed northward through tropical seas under overcast skies, the weight of those sunken ships pressed on every commander's mind. Norman Scott had spent weeks drilling his force in night combat procedures that the Navy establishment considered impractical or impossible. He had developed tactical innovations that contradicted conventional cruiser doctrine. He believed radar could provide the advantage needed to overcome Japanese optical superiority. But belief and reality were different things, and reality in these waters had been consistently brutal. The ships beneath the waves were testament to that. In less than 48 hours, Scott would discover whether his theories could survive contact with an enemy that had never lost a night surface action. The Iron Bottom waited to see if it would claim more ships, or if this time the debt might finally be paid. Rear Admiral Norman Scott stood in the flag plot aboard USS San Francisco on the evening of October 7, 1942, reviewing handwritten notes that represented months of careful thought about how American cruisers might survive against Japanese night tactics. At 53 years old, Scott was not the profile of a typical fighting admiral. He was a Naval Academy gunnery instructor, methodical and analytical, and more comfortable with tactical diagrams than with the aggressive destroyer-man culture that dominated much of the surface Navy. His officers sometimes called him the Professor, though never quite to his face, and the nickname captured both respect for his intellect and subtle skepticism about whether classroom theories would work when Japanese shells started falling. Scott knew what his critics thought, but he also knew that conventional tactics had led straight to disaster at Savo Island. The tactical doctrine Scott had developed centered on a formation he privately called Plan X, though official reports would simply term it a single-column, line-ahead arrangement. Every conventional wisdom about cruiser tactics emphasized parallel columns or divisions that could maneuver independently. But Scott had concluded this approach guaranteed chaos and darkness when visual communication was impossible and radio traffic easily misunderstood. His alternative was radical in its simplicity: one column of ships, rigidly spaced at 700-yard intervals, with destroyers at the van and rear to screen the cruisers and provide illumination when targets were acquired. The formation sacrificed flexibility for control, assuming that in night combat, coordinated fire from a unified formation would prove more valuable than individual initiative. Throughout September, Scott had drilled Task Force 64 relentlessly, conducting night exercises that left gun crews exhausted and frustrated. The training regime was unprecedented in its intensity: 23 separate night drills in just over 4 weeks, and including live fire exercises where ships practiced rapid target acquisition and coordinated salvos in darkness. Many officers grumbled that Scott was driving the crews too hard, that the drills were unrealistic, that real combat would never match the controlled conditions of exercises. But Scott persisted with a determination born from studying the Savo Island after-action reports and recognizing that American forces had been defeated not primarily by superior Japanese equipment, but by superior Japanese training. If Japan had spent years preparing for night combat, America would have to compress that learning into weeks. The centerpiece of Scott's tactical innovation was what he termed the battle turn, a predetermined maneuver where all ships simultaneously executed a 180-degree turn and are bringing their broadsides to bear on detected targets while maintaining formation integrity. In theory, this would allow Task Force 64 to engage from multiple angles without the confusion of independent maneuvering. Scott had calculated precise timing and spacing requirements, working out the mathematics of ship speeds, turning radii, and gun-firing arcs on paper in his cabin. He had walked through the maneuver with his staff using models on a plotting table, anticipating problems and refining the procedure. But paper calculations and actual execution under fire were vastly different propositions, and Scott was acutely aware that his entire tactical concept remained untested against a real enemy. The composition of Task Force 64 reflected both the resources available and the compromises necessary. In October 1942, heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City provided the main battery firepower, 9 8-inch guns each, capable of throwing 260-pound shells to ranges exceeding 15 miles. Light cruisers Boise and Helena added 15 6-inch guns apiece, with faster firing rates compensating for smaller shell weight. The 5 destroyers brought speed, torpedoes, and the searchlights that would be critical for target illumination in Scott's doctrine. But the task force had crucial weaknesses that kept Scott awake at night. Only Helena and Boise carried the new SG surface search radar, meaning 3 cruisers would be fighting partially blind. And the destroyer captains had varying levels of experience with night operations, creating potential for confusion in the critical opening minutes of any engagement. Scott's background set him apart from most surface warfare officers and partly explained why his superiors had given him this mission, despite their reservations about his unconventional methods. He had spent years as a gunnery instructor at the Naval Academy, teaching midshipmen the science of naval ballistics, fire control systems, and the coordination of multi-ship gun batteries. This pedagogical experience had given him a systematic approach to problem-solving that frustrated officers who preferred intuitive, aggressive decision-making. Scott believed complex problems could be broken down into manageable components, practiced until they became instinctive, then reassembled into effective doctrine. It was a teacher's methodology applied to warfare, and it drove some of his subordinates to distraction, even as others recognized its potential value. The relationship between Scott and his ship captains varied considerably, creating tensions that would prove significant in combat. Captain Gilbert Hoover of Helena was perhaps Scott's most enthusiastic supporter, recognizing immediately that radar provided capabilities that could revolutionize night fighting if properly exploited. Hoover had spent considerable time educating himself about radar technology, visiting the Combat Information Center regularly, and learning to interpret the cathode ray tube displays personally rather than simply trusting subordinates. By contrast, some destroyer captains found Scott's rigid formations requirements constraining, accustomed as they were to the aggressive independence that destroyer doctrine traditionally encouraged. These tensions simmered beneath the surface of military courtesy, waiting for the stress of combat to expose them. On October 8th, Scott conducted a final wardroom briefing aboard San Francisco, explaining Plan X to his assembled commanders with the aid of diagrams and careful verbal description. The plan required destroyers at the head of the column to use their searchlights to illuminate enemy targets once contact was made, allowing the cruisers to acquire firing solutions without relying solely on their own optical equipment. The entire column would then execute coordinated turns to optimize gun-bearing angles while maintaining formation discipline. Scott emphasized repeatedly that radio communications must be kept concise and clear, that individual initiative was subordinate to formation integrity, that the goal was coordinated violence rather than individual heroism. Some officers listened intently, absorbing the logic. Others nodded politely while harboring private doubts about whether such careful choreography could survive the chaos they knew night combat would bring. The shadow of Savo Island hung over every tactical discussion, every training drill, every quiet conversation in the officers' mess. Norman Scott had not been present at that battle, but he had read every available report, interviewed survivors, studied the wreckage patterns and casualty distributions. He understood that American forces had been defeated by a combination of factors: poor communications, scattered formations, radar misinterpretation, and simple unpreparedness for the speed and violence of Japanese attack. His tactical doctrine attempted to address each vulnerability systematically, but Scott also knew that doctrine was one thing and execution quite another, that the gap between plan and reality was where battles were won or lost. As Task Force 64 departed Espiritu Santo on October 10th, sailing toward the waters off Guadalcanal, Scott stood on San Francisco's bridge and wondered if his months of preparation would prove sufficient, or if he was simply leading more ships to join the Iron Bottom. The admiral carried a burden that few of his officers fully understood: the knowledge that he was attempting something the United States Navy had never successfully accomplished in this war. And no American surface force had yet defeated Japanese ships in a night engagement. Every encounter had ended in American retreat, damage, or disaster. Scott's task was not merely to intercept a convoy, but to break a psychological barrier, to prove that American forces could fight and win in darkness against an enemy that seemed to own the night. The weight of that responsibility showed in the meticulous attention to detail that characterized his every order, the careful rehearsals he demanded, the refusal to leave anything to chance that could be controlled through planning. Norman Scott was betting his career, his ships, and the lives of thousands of men on the proposition that systematic preparation could overcome both enemy expertise and American inexperience. In less than 72 hours, he would discover whether that bet would pay off or simply add more wrecks to the collection at Iron Bottom Sound. The anchorage at Shortland Harbor on the morning of October 11, 1942, bustled with the controlled chaos of a routine supply operation that Japanese forces had executed so many times it had acquired the rhythm of predictability. Seaplane tenders Nishin and Chitose sat low in the water, their holds packed with artillery pieces, ammunition crates, and 728 soldiers of the Japanese Army's reinforcement contingent destined for Guadalcanal. On the bridges of heavy cruisers Aoba, Furutaka, and Kinugasa, officers reviewed navigation charts and timetables with the casual confidence of men who had made this run more than 20 times without serious opposition. The operation the Japanese called a reinforcement mission, and the Americans bitterly termed the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, had become so successful that it had bred a dangerous sense of invulnerability. Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto commanded the cruiser force from his flagship Aoba, a heavy cruiser displacing nearly 9,000 tons and armed with 6 8-inch guns and 3 twin turrets. At 54 years old, Goto was an experienced officer who had participated in operations from the China coast to the South Pacific. a professional who understood both the strategic importance of maintaining Guadalcanal's garrison and the tactical realities of operating in contested waters. But the very success of previous Tokyo Express runs had created assumptions that would prove catastrophic, that American surface forces lacked the capability or will to challenge Japanese ships at night. That radar remained too primitive to provide effective warning, that air superiority during daylight hours mattered more than surface threats after dark. These assumptions permeated the operational planning for the October 11th mission. The Japanese tactical doctrine for these supply runs prioritized speed and timing over combat readiness. Ships would approach at high speed, typically 30 knots or more, arriving at Guadalcanal after nightfall when American aircraft from Henderson Field could not operate effectively. The unloading would proceed rapidly, often completed in under 2 hours, and the force would depart while darkness still prevailed. Placing maximum distance between themselves and Guadalcanal before dawn brought renewed air attacks. Combat with American surface forces was considered unlikely because previous experience suggested American ships avoided night engagements, still traumatized by the Savo Island disaster. This operational template had worked consistently since August, reinforcing the belief that it would continue working indefinitely. The composition of Goto's force reflected this emphasis on transport protection rather than anti-surface warfare. The 3 heavy cruisers, Aoba, Furutaka, and Kinugasa, sailed in column formation with comfortable spacing, their crews at cruising stations rather than full battle readiness. Destroyers Fubuki and Hatsuyuki provided screening. But they too operated under the assumption that their primary threat would be American PT boats or possibly submarines, not a coordinated cruiser force. The seaplane tenders, laden with their precious cargo of reinforcements and supplies, followed 10 miles behind the cruiser screen, vulnerable but protected by the calculation that American forces would not risk night surface combat. The entire formation steamed northwest to southeast down the slot with the routine efficiency of a well-practiced maneuver. Japanese technological advantages remained formidable even when not fully exploited for combat. The Type 93 torpedo, carried by all the cruisers and destroyers, represented the pinnacle of pre-war Japanese naval development, 24 inches in diameter, all powered by oxygen to eliminate the telltale wake that compressed air torpedoes produced, capable of ranges exceeding 24 miles at speeds of 36 knots. Each warhead contained over 1,000 pounds of high explosive, sufficient to break a cruiser's back with a single hit. Japanese optical equipment, refined through years of emphasis on night combat training, included binoculars and rangefinders of exceptional quality that allowed trained lookouts to spot ships at ranges where American observers saw nothing. These technological assets existed in the force steaming toward Guadalcanal, but operational priorities had not positioned them for maximum effectiveness. The intelligence failure on the Japanese side was comprehensive and would prove lethal. Radio intercepts and Coastwatcher reports had not detected the departure of Scott's Task Force 64 from Espiritu Santo, partly due to strict radio silence maintained by American ships, and partly because Japanese intelligence priorities focused on tracking American carrier movements rather than cruiser forces. The assumption that American surface forces would not actively hunt Japanese ships at night had become so ingrained that it created a blind spot in operational planning. When Goto's staff conducted their final briefing before departure, the primary concerns discussed were timing to avoid air attack and procedures for rapid unloading, not contingencies for surface combat against a peer opponent. This would prove to be a fatal oversight. Aboard Aoba, Goto's demeanor reflected the routine nature of what his staff expected to be another successful supply run. Officers later recalled that the admiral seemed relaxed, confident that the operation would proceed smoothly based on the pattern of previous missions. The ship's crew was not at full battle stations despite operating in waters that American forces technically contested. Gun crews were at reduced readiness, damage control parties had not set full watertight integrity, and torpedo tubes were trained inboard rather than aimed for quick firing. This was not negligence. It was the logical result of 22 successful runs that had encountered no significant resistance. Success had created patterns, Patterns had created assumptions, and assumptions had created vulnerability. The strategic importance of this particular mission added weight that the tactical dispositions did not reflect. The 728 soldiers and the artillery pieces being transported represented a significant reinforcement for Japanese forces attempting to retake Henderson Field. American control of that airstrip was strangling Japanese supply efforts during daylight hours, making these nighttime runs increasingly critical. If the October 11th mission succeeded, Japanese commanders believed they could mount a major offensive against the Marine positions within days. If it failed, the garrison would remain undersupplied and unable to mount effective operations. The stakes were high, but the tactical approach reflected routine rather than the heightened caution that might have been appropriate given what was actually at risk. As Goto's force steamed southeast through the afternoon of October 11th, the gap between perception and reality was about to close with devastating speed. The admiral and his staff believed they were conducting a routine supply run with minimal risk from surface threats. They did not know that American cryptanalysts had decoded enough of their communications to predict the operation. They did not know that Norman Scott had positioned Task Force 64 directly across their projected path. They did not know that American ships equipped with surface search radar were already tracking their approach. The routine mission was about to collide with an ambush, and the assumptions born from months of success were about to be tested against an enemy that had finally learned to fight at night. The Tokyo Express was running on schedule, unaware that this time, the tracks ahead led straight into disaster. The fundamental miscalculation underlying the entire operation was strategic rather than merely tactical. Japanese naval leadership had concluded that American psychological trauma from Savo Island would prevent aggressive night surface operations for months, possibly years. This assessment was not entirely wrong. Many American commanders remained deeply reluctant to risk night engagements, but it failed to account for the pressure on American forces to disrupt Japanese reinforcement operations, the availability of intelligence providing advance warning, and the emergence of officers like Norman Scott willing to challenge conventional assumptions with systematic preparation and new technology. The gap between what Japanese commanders believed about American capabilities and what American forces had actually become was about to manifest in the darkness off Cape Esperance, measured in shells, torpedoes, and lives. The basement offices of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor on October 9, 1942, held some of the Pacific War's most valuable secrets, though from the outside the building appeared unremarkable, just another administrative structure in a naval complex still rebuilding from the devastation of December 7th. Inside, cryptanalysts worked around the clock on the Japanese Navy's JN-25 operational code, a complex cipher system that had resisted complete solution but yielded enough information to provide American commanders with glimpses into enemy planning. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the effort with an intensity that sometimes worried his superiors, working such long hours that he often slept in the office and appeared at briefings wearing a smoking jacket instead of proper uniform. The work was tedious, mathematical, and frequently frustrating, but when breakthroughs occurred, they could change the course of battles. The intercept that arrived at Hypo on October 9th appeared initially unremarkable, routine Japanese naval traffic discussing logistics and timing for operations in the Solomon Islands area. But as cryptanalysts worked through the partially broken code, certain details emerged with actionable clarity. Our Japanese forces were planning a reinforcement mission to Guadalcanal for October 11th. The force would include multiple cruisers and destroyers escorting seaplane tenders loaded with troops and supplies. The timing was specific enough to calculate approximate arrival windows, though the exact route remained unclear due to portions of the message that remained encrypted. This was typical of JN-25 decryption in October 1942, enough information to provide strategic warning but incomplete tactical detail. The intelligence summary traveled up the chain of command with remarkable speed once Hypo's analysts confirmed their assessment. From Rochefort's basement, the information went to Admiral Chester Nimitz at SINCPAT's headquarters, where staff officers evaluated its reliability and potential operational significance. And Nimitz, who had learned to trust signals intelligence after its spectacular success at Midway in June, ordered the information forwarded immediately to Admiral Gormley at South Pacific Command in Noumea. The communication chain functioned effectively, but each relay added hours to the timeline. By the time actionable intelligence reached the commanders who would actually use it, precious time had elapsed. This lag between detection and action was an unavoidable reality of the intelligence process, and it meant that operational planning had to account for enemy movements that might have changed by the time friendly forces reached the intercept point. The technical limitations of code breaking in October 1942 shaped what intelligence could and could not provide. JN-25 was only partially broken. Meaning cryptanalysts could decrypt perhaps 10 to 40% of any given message depending on its content and the code groups used. Critical details sometimes remained hidden in the encrypted portions, forcing analysts to make educated guesses based on context and previous decrypts. The October 9th intercept provided clear indication of timing and general force composition, but left gaps regarding exact speeds, precise routes, and whether additional forces might be assigned to the operation. Intelligence officers had to communicate both what they knew and the limits of their knowledge, avoiding the temptation to fill gaps with speculation that might prove wrong when tested against reality. Aboard USS Helena on the morning of October 11th, the ship's intelligence officer briefed Captain Gilbert Hoover on what signals intelligence had revealed about expected Japanese movements. The briefing was necessarily sanitized. Operational security demanded that even ship captains not be told explicitly about code-breaking capabilities, lest the information somehow reach Japanese intelligence and compromise the entire effort. Instead, the intelligence was attributed to various sources including radio direction finding, analysis of communication patterns, and coastal observer reports. Hoover understood the game being played and asked no uncomfortable questions, focusing instead on what the information meant for his ship's operational requirements. The intelligence suggested Helena's radar might detect Japanese forces that evening, and Hoover ordered his radar operators to conduct additional training drills to ensure readiness. The verification of signals intelligence came at 11:45 hours on October 11th, when a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft sighted Japanese ships approximately 200 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The visual sighting confirmed what the Codebreakers had predicted: 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, additional vessels trailing behind. The pilot's radio report provided course, speed, and composition data that matched intelligence predictions with remarkable accuracy, validating the signal's intelligence and giving Norman Scott confidence that his task force was positioned to intercept an actual enemy force rather than chasing phantom contacts. This convergence of different intelligence sources, communications intercept, and aerial reconnaissance provided the kind of confirmation that commanders needed to commit to aggressive action. The intelligence advantage Scott possessed represented a fundamental shift from previous American operations in the Solomons. At Savo Island, American forces had been caught by surprise despite warning signs because intelligence had not reached tactical commanders in time or had been misinterpreted. At Cape Esperance, Scott knew the enemy was coming, had reasonable estimates of force composition and timing, and had positioned his task force to exploit that knowledge. But intelligence alone was not victory. It was merely opportunity. The advantage of knowing where Japanese ships would be mattered only if American forces could successfully engage them. And that required tactical execution that previous battles had proven was far from guaranteed. The Codebreakers had provided the gift of foreknowledge, but using that gift effectively would depend on radar operators, gun crews, and commanders making split-second decisions in darkness and chaos. The architecture of naval intelligence in the Pacific War was complex and often fragile, depending on radio intercept stations scattered across the ocean, cryptanalysts working in basement offices thousands of miles from the battles, communication systems vulnerable to weather and enemy action, and commanders willing to trust information from sources they couldn't directly verify. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor was just one node in this network, coordinated with Station Cast in Australia and Station Nigat in Washington, each contributing to the overall picture of Japanese naval movements. The system worked imperfectly, sometimes providing brilliant insights and sometimes missing critical developments. But it represented a capability that Japan had nothing equivalent to match. American code breaking was systematically reading Japanese operational traffic, while Japanese intelligence remained largely blind to American planning, creating an asymmetry that would prove decisive in multiple battles throughout the Pacific Campaign. The human dimension of signals intelligence often went unrecognized by the commanders who benefited from it. The cryptanalysts at Hypo worked punishing hours in cramped conditions, wrestling with mathematical problems that had no obvious solutions, and experiencing far more failures than successes in their attempts to break encrypted messages. When breakthroughs occurred, the analysts rarely learned what operational impact their work had produced. Security protocols prevented feedback that might compromise methods and sources. Joseph Rochefort and his team would not know until after the war how many lives their October 9th decrypt had saved, would not see the Japanese ships burning in the darkness off Cape Esperance, would not witness the validation of their grueling mathematical labor. They simply continued working, processing the next intercept, attacking the next code group, contributing to a form of warfare that would prove as decisive as any battleship salvo. As Scott's Task Force 64 steamed toward the waters off Guadalcanal on the afternoon of October 11th, the intelligence advantage provided by code breaking gave the admiral something previous American commanders had lacked: the initiative. He was hunting rather than being hunted, attacking rather than defending, exploiting foreknowledge rather than reacting to surprise. But Scott also understood the limitations of his advantage. Intelligence told him Japanese ships were coming, but could not guarantee his radar would detect them in time, could not ensure his formation would hold together under fire, could not eliminate the superior Japanese night-fighting training and weapons that had devastated American forces at Savo Island. The Codebreakers had opened a door, but walking through it successfully would require everything Scott had spent months preparing: tactical innovation, technological exploitation, disciplined execution, and a measure of luck that no amount of planning could guarantee. The gift of intelligence was precious, but it was not sufficient. Victory would require turning knowledge into effective action, and that test still lay ahead in the darkness. The installation of the SG surface search radar aboard USS Helena in September 1942 required 3 days of work by civilian technicians from RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, who traveled to Pearl Harbor specifically to outfit ships with equipment so new it still had bugs requiring field modification. The radar itself consisted of a rectangular antenna mounted atop the ship's mainmast, rotating continuously to sweep the horizon with microwave pulses at 10-centimeter wavelength. Below decks, in a specially configured compartment, operators watched cathode ray tube displays where radar returns appeared as bright spikes against a circular grid representing distance and bearing. The technology was revolutionary, but in October 1942, it was so new that most naval officers viewed it with skepticism, uncertain whether to trust electronic returns over the evidence of their own eyes. Lieutenant Commander Rodman Smith, Helena's radar officer, had become an evangelist for the technology after seeing what it could do during training exercises off Hawaii. Smith had spent weeks learning the equipment's capabilities and limitations, understanding that radar could detect ships at 15 miles under ideal conditions, but was degraded by rain, could sometimes produce false returns from clouds or sea conditions, and required skilled interpretation to distinguish between genuine contacts and spurious signals. He conducted training sessions for bridge officers, attempting to explain how cathode ray tube displays worked and why electronic detection could provide advantage over visual observation in darkness or poor visibility. Some officers listened with genuine interest, recognizing that radar represented a potential solution to the night fighting problem that had devastated American forces. Others nodded politely while privately thinking that nothing could replace a trained lookout's eyes. The technical specifications of the SG radar placed it far ahead of the older SC air search radar that most American ships carried. The SC set used a longer wavelength that was better for detecting aircraft at high altitude, but provided poor resolution for surface targets, often unable to distinguish individual ships in a formation or accurately determine bearing. The SG's shorter wavelength and narrower beam width allowed operators to see individual ships, track their movements, measure course and speed with reasonable accuracy, and potentially detect targets at night or in conditions where visual observation was impossible. But the equipment had limitations that operators learned through experience rather than from technical manuals. Range accuracy varied with sea conditions. Small targets like destroyers could be masked by larger ships behind them, and the rotating antenna's mechanical reliability remained questionable under combat conditions. And Captain Gilbert Hoover's trust in radar technology set him apart from many cruiser commanders and would prove critical in the coming battle. Hoover regularly visited Helena's Combat Information Center, the compartment where radar operators worked, asking detailed questions about what the equipment could and could not do. He studied the cathode ray displays himself, learning to interpret the bright returns and understanding the difference between genuine contacts and clutter. During training exercises, Hoover had ordered Helena to maneuver based on radar information, even when visual observers saw nothing, building confidence in the technology among his bridge officers by demonstrating that electronic returns provided accurate picture of ship positions. And this confidence was not universal in the Navy. Many commanders still considered radar an interesting novelty, rather than a primary tactical sensor. The human factor in radar operation was at least as important as the equipment itself. Radar operators in October 1942 were typically young enlisted men with minimal training, learning their craft through on-the-job experience rather than extensive formal schooling. The training pipeline for radar technicians was still being developed, and the men watching the scopes aboard Helena and Boise had perhaps 6 months' experience with the equipment, much of it during peacetime steaming rather than combat operations. They had to learn to distinguish radar returns from ships versus returns from land masses or weather, and to estimate target course and speed from the movement of returns across successive sweeps, to communicate what they were seeing to bridge officers who often didn't fully understand the technology. The margin for error was slim, and mistakes could mean disaster. The integration of radar information into tactical decision-making remained a largely unsolved problem in October 1942. Navy doctrine had not caught up with technology. There were no established procedures for how commanders should use radar contacts, whether electronic detection should take precedence over visual confirmation, how to coordinate radar information from multiple ships. Norman Scott grappled with these questions as he planned his approach to night combat, recognizing that radar provided potential advantage but uncertain how to exploit it systematically. He knew that Helena's radar could detect Japanese ships before they were visible, but translating detection into effective fire control required solving multiple problems simultaneously: identifying targets, calculating firing solutions, coordinating multiple ships' guns, all while maintaining formation discipline in darkness. The crucial limitation Scott faced was that only Helena and Boise among his cruisers carried the SG radar. San Francisco and Salt Lake City had only the older SC air search radar, essentially blind to surface contacts until targets came within visual range. This meant the task force would detect contacts unevenly. Helena might see Japanese ships at 14 miles, while other cruisers saw nothing, all creating potential for confusion about contact locations, and potentially dangerous situations where ships fired at radar contacts that other ships couldn't confirm. Scott had to design tactics that accounted for this disparity, giving more responsibility to the radar-equipped ships, while ensuring the entire formation could respond coherently once targets were detected. The solution he developed placed heavy reliance on Helena and Boise reporting contacts to San Francisco via TBS radio. But radio communication added its own opportunities for misunderstanding. The Combat Information Center aboard Helena represented a new concept in naval warfare, though the name would not be formalized until later in the war. The compartment housed not just radar equipment, but also plotting tables where staff marked contact positions, communication systems linking the CIC to the bridge and gunnery control, and officers trained to synthesize information from multiple sources into a coherent tactical picture. Lieutenant Commander Cecil Count Morris supervised Helena's CIC, coordinating between radar operators watching their scopes, plotters marking contacts on charts, and Captain Hoover on the bridge, who needed clear, concise reports about what radar was seeing. The CIC concept was that officers in this compartment could maintain better situational awareness than officers on the bridge whose vision was limited to what they could physically see. But making this work required trust, communication, and procedures that were still being invented in real time. As Task Force 64 approached the waters off Cape Esperance on the evening of October 11th, our radar operators aboard Helena and Boise conducted final checks of their equipment. They adjusted tuning to optimize range and resolution, verified that the antenna rotation was smooth and consistent, tested communication links to ensure they could report contacts without delay. The operators knew their role could be decisive. If radar detected Japanese ships early enough, American forces might achieve surprise despite inferior night fighting training. If radar failed or was misinterpreted, the task force might stumble into a meeting engagement where Japanese tactical superiority would prove devastating. The electronic eye that radar provided was powerful, but it was still new, still imperfectly understood, still dependent on young men with limited training making correct interpretations under stress. Everything Scott had planned assumed radar would provide the advantage needed to overcome Japanese expertise. Whether that assumption was valid would be determined in the darkness ahead. The broader significance of radar in naval warfare was only beginning to be understood in October 1942. The technology would eventually revolutionize fleet operations, enabling formations to maintain cohesion in darkness and poor weather, detecting air attacks with time to respond, tracking surface contacts at ranges that optical systems could never match. But this future was not yet visible to the men aboard Helena watching their cathode ray tubes on the night of October 11th. They were pioneers working with equipment that might or might not function as hoped, using procedures that might or might not prove effective, attempting to solve problems that the Navy had never systematically addressed. The electronic eye could see farther than human vision, but whether that sight would translate into victory remained an open question as American and Japanese forces converged in the darkness. The test of technology, training, and nerve was just hours away. The afternoon of October 11th, 1942, found two naval forces steaming toward the same patch of ocean with entirely different expectations about what the evening would bring. Norman Scott's Task Force 64 had rounded the northwestern tip of Guadalcanal at approximately 2,000 hours, entering the waters between Savo Island and Cape Esperance that American sailors had grimly renamed Iron Bottom Sound. The formation maintained tight discipline. Destroyers Fahrenholt, Duncan, Yass and Laffey led the column at 700-yard intervals, followed by cruisers San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena, with destroyers Buchanan and McCalla bringing up the rear. Speed was set at 20 knots, a pace that allowed precise station keeping while conserving fuel for the high-speed maneuvering that combat would demand. Visibility was poor under overcast skies with no moon, exactly the conditions that favored Japanese night fighting tactics, but also made radar potentially decisive. Simultaneously, some 50 miles to the northwest, Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto's force approached from the opposite direction in a formation that reflected routine rather than combat readiness. Heavy cruisers Aoba, Furutaka, and Kinugasa steamed in a relaxed column with wider spacing than would be appropriate for battle stations, as their crews at cruising watch rather than full alert. Destroyers Fubuki and Hatsuyuki flanked the cruiser column, providing anti-submarine screening, but not positioned for immediate surface combat. The seaplane tenders Nishin and Chitos followed approximately 10 miles behind, laden with their cargo of 728 soldiers and artillery pieces. The entire force moved at 30 knots, prioritizing speed to minimize time in waters where American aircraft might operate during daylight hours. Officers aboard Aoba reviewed timing calculations for the unloading operation at Guadalcanal, discussing logistics procedures with the same casual efficiency that had characterized 22 previous successful runs. The environmental conditions on that October night created a tactical landscape that would shape everything that followed. Overcast clouds blocked starlight and moonlight, reducing visibility to perhaps 2 or 3 miles at best. Conditions where even trained lookouts struggled to distinguish ships from shadows. The sea state was slight with winds of 8 knots from the southeast, smooth enough that optical equipment would not be degraded by spray or excessive ship motion. Temperature stood at approximately 27 degrees Celsius, with humidity typical of tropical latitudes, conditions that would later prove relevant when powder bags ignited in damaged ships. The weather favored neither side inherently. It simply created an environment where visual detection would be difficult for everyone, potentially equalizing the Japanese advantage in optical equipment while elevating the importance of radar that could see through darkness. Aboard San Francisco's flag plot, Norman Scott reviewed his tactical plan one final time as the task force entered patrol position. The plan called for Scott to patrol back and forth across a 15-mile front between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, covering the approaches that Japanese forces would most likely use. When radar detected contacts, the formation would maneuver to cross the enemy's T, positioning American ships perpendicular to the Japanese line of advance, allowing all American guns to bear, while only Japanese lead ships could return fire. Destroyers at the van would illuminate targets with searchlights once visual range was reached, enabling precise fire control. The entire concept depended on coordination, discipline, and radar, providing enough warning to execute the maneuver before Japanese forces detected the American presence. Scott knew his plan was sound in theory, but theory and execution were vastly different things. The timing of the approaching convergence was driven by factors neither commander fully controlled. Japanese planning assumed arrival at Guadalcanal around midnight, allowing several hours for unloading, before dawn brought air attacks. American intelligence predicted Japanese arrival in roughly the same time frame, and Scott had positioned his force to intercept along the most probable approach route. But naval operations rarely proceeded exactly on schedule. Variations in speed, course changes to avoid contacts or hazards, uncertainties in navigation, all created temporal flexibility that made precise timing impossible. The two forces were converging, but exactly when and where they would meet remained uncertain. This uncertainty created tension aboard American ships, where officers knew contact was likely but not precisely when to expect it. The psychological state of the opposing forces reflected their different operational experiences and expectations. American sailors approaching their patrol station carried the weight of Savo Island and subsequent defeats, knowing they were entering waters where Japanese forces had consistently dominated. Gun crews conducted final checks of their weapons, with hands that some admitted later were not entirely steady. Damage control parties reviewed procedures for fighting fires and controlling flooding, to preparing for casualties that recent history suggested were likely. Yet there was also determination born from training and from intelligence suggesting they would have advantage of surprise. Officers who had drilled endlessly under Scott's demanding regime felt some confidence that their preparation might matter. The mood combined apprehension with resolve, fear tempered by readiness. By contrast, Japanese crews approached the operation with the relaxed confidence of routine. Officers aboard Goto's cruisers discussed unloading procedures and timing, treating the mission as the logistical exercise they expected it to be. Gun crews were not at full battle stations, and many sailors were actually off watch, resting before the work of unloading would begin. This was not complacency in the sense of negligence. It was rational behavior based on experience suggesting that American surface forces would not challenge them at night. 22 successful runs had created a pattern, and patterns created expectations. The expectation was another routine mission, and nothing in the intelligence available to Japanese commanders suggested otherwise. This gap between expectation and impending reality would prove catastrophic. At 22:30 hours, Scott ordered a course change to southwest, beginning the first leg of his patrol pattern across the suspected Japanese approach route. The formation executed the turn precisely, maintaining intervals and formation integrity despite darkness that made visual station keeping impossible. This precision reflected the training Scott had insisted upon. The endless drills that had seemed excessive to some officers, but now paid dividends in the ability to maneuver coherently without visual reference. Aboard Helena, radar operators watched their scopes carefully, seeing land returns from Savo Island and Guadalcanal that helped them calibrate the equipment, but no contacts yet indicating enemy ships. The waiting continued, tension building, as officers checked chronometers and calculated that if intelligence predictions were accurate, contact should occur within the next hour. By 2300 hours, the two forces were approximately 20 miles apart, closing at a combined speed of roughly 45 knots. Simple mathematics suggested contact within approximately 25 minutes, though neither side knew the other's exact position. Japanese lookouts strained to see through darkness, looking for the low silhouettes of possible PT boats or the wake patterns that might indicate American destroyers. They were not expecting cruisers because doctrine and experience suggested American cruiser forces avoided night combat. American radar operators aboard Helena and Boise watched their scopes with concentration, knowing that contact might appear at any moment as bright returns against the circular grid of their displays. The electronic equipment was functioning normally, sweeping the ocean ahead with microwave pulses that would reveal Japanese ships before they became visible. The approach phase was ending, and detection was imminent. The final minutes before contact represented the culmination of two entirely different operational philosophies colliding in darkness. The Japanese forces approached with tactical expertise refined through years of night combat training, superior optical equipment, devastating torpedoes, and the confidence of unbroken success. American forces approached with systematic preparation, technological advantage through radar, coordinated fire doctrine, and determination to prove they could fight at night. Neither side yet knew the other was there, but the gap was closing at nearly 1,000 yards per minute. In less than half an hour, the first radar contact would appear on Helena's scope, and the carefully laid plans of both admirals would collide with the chaotic reality of night surface combat. The approach was ending, and the test was about to begin. At precisely 23:25 hours on October 11th, 1942, a radar operator aboard USS Helena named his contact into the intercom with practiced calm that belied the significance of what he was reporting. The SG radar scope showed multiple surface returns bearing 315 degrees true, range approximately 27,000 yards, just over 14 miles to the northwest. The returns were distinct and strong, indicating ships rather than weather or clutter, and their positions suggested a formation of at least 5 vessels steaming in column. Lieutenant Commander Cecil Morris in Helena's Combat Information Center immediately began plotting the contacts, calculating their course as approximately 135 degrees, and their speed as roughly 30 knots. Within 90 seconds, Morris had confirmed that these were almost certainly the Japanese force intelligence had predicted. And he ordered the contact report transmitted to Admiral Scott aboard San Francisco. The moment of radar detection represented the payoff for months of technological development and training, though few aboard Helena fully appreciated the historical significance of what had just occurred. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had detected Japanese ships at night before being detected themselves, gaining the priceless advantage of knowing the enemy's position while remaining invisible. The 14-mile detection range gave Scott approximately 10 minutes before Japanese lookouts would be able to spot American ships visually, 10 minutes to maneuver, to prepare, to transform detection into tactical advantage. But those 10 minutes also created a different kind of pressure, as because Scott had to decide immediately how to use the advantage radar had provided. The decision point had arrived with the appearance of those bright returns on Helena's cathode ray tube. Captain Gilbert Hoover aboard Helena did not hesitate. At 23:27 hours, he transmitted the contact report to San Francisco via TBS radio. Multiple surface contacts bearing 315 degrees, range 27,000 yards, course 135, speed 30 knots. The report was clear, concise, and accurate, exactly what doctrine required. But aboard San Francisco's flag plot, Scott faced an immediate problem that intelligence briefings had anticipated but not resolved. Destroyers from another American force had been operating in the area earlier, and Scott could not be certain whether Helena's contacts were the expected Japanese force or those American destroyers returning from their mission. The consequences of error were severe. Engaging American ships would be a catastrophic friendly fire disaster, but waiting too long to confirm might squander the radar advantage entirely. The 90 seconds that followed Helena's initial contact report have been analyzed by naval historians ever since, representing one of those crucial decision points where the outcome of battle hung on choices made under uncertainty with inadequate information. Scott queried his staff about the whereabouts of the American destroyers, receiving responses that were uncertain rather than definitive. He examined the plot, showing Helena's contacts approaching from the northwest, the direction from which Japanese forces were expected, but also a direction from which American destroyers might approach. The contact speed of 30 knots matched Japanese destroyer and cruiser capabilities, but also matched what aggressive American destroyer captains might sustain. Every piece of information was ambiguous. Every indicator could be interpreted multiple ways. Scott needed certainty, but had only probability. At 23:28 hours, Scott made his decision, a compromise between immediate attack and cautious verification. He ordered, "Stand by to open fire." The order communicated to his force that combat was imminent while stopping short of actually commencing fire until visual confirmation could be obtained. It was a reasonable decision given the uncertainty, but it created its own problems. The TBS radio transmission was heard by all ships in the formation, and different commanders interpreted "stand by" differently. Some understood it as a warning to prepare for imminent combat. Others, particularly destroyer captains conditioned to aggressive action, heard it as authorization to attack at their own discretion. This ambiguity in interpretation would contribute to the chaos that followed. The geometry of the tactical situation was evolving rapidly as both forces continued moving. Scott's formation was steaming southwest at 20 knots, while the Japanese force approached from the northwest at 30 knots, creating a closing rate of approximately 45 knots, or roughly 800 yards per minute. As the range was decreasing from 14 miles toward the 8 to 10 mile distance where Japanese lookouts might spot American ships in good conditions, or the 5-mile range where detection became virtually certain, even in darkness. Scott needed to maneuver his force to cross the Japanese T before being detected, but maneuvering would disrupt his careful formation and potentially confuse his own ships about each other's positions. The tactical problem was complex, and the time available to solve it was measured in minutes. Aboard the Japanese flagship Aoba, lookouts and watch officers maintained their routine scan of the surrounding waters, looking primarily for PT boats or possible submarine periscopes. The heavy cruiser's position at the head of the column gave her lookouts the best chance of detecting threats. But those lookouts were scanning for small, fast targets, not for a cruiser force in column formation. Japanese doctrine assumed American surface forces would not be in the area, an assumption that created perceptual filters, making officers less likely to correctly interpret ambiguous contacts, even if they detected them. The psychological factor of expecting routine mission rather than combat meant that Japanese observers were not in the heightened state of alertness that might have detected American ships sooner. They were looking for what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. The critical advantage radar provided was not merely detection range, but also precision. Helena's radar operators could track the Japanese contacts continuously, updating their position, course, and speed every few seconds as the antenna completed each rotation. This continuous tracking allowed accurate prediction of where Japanese ships would be minutes in the future, enabling Scott to calculate intercept courses and firing solutions before visual contact. By contrast, Japanese forces had only their optical equipment, which in the existing visibility conditions could not detect American ships at all. The asymmetry was profound. One side could see, and the other was blind, though the blind side did not yet know it. This asymmetry would not last much longer, but for a few more minutes, it gave Scott an advantage no American commander had possessed in previous night battles. At 23:29 hours, with range now down to approximately 24,000 yards, Scott faced the decision he could no longer defer. Helena's radar plot showed the contacts continuing to close, now clearly on a course that would bring them across the front of Scott's formation. If these were Japanese ships, and probability increasingly suggested they were, then Scott needed to maneuver immediately to achieve favorable position. But maneuvering meant committing to combat before absolute visual confirmation, accepting the small but non-zero risk that he might be maneuvering to attack American ships. The choice was stark. Use the radar advantage aggressively, but with slight uncertainty, or wait for visual confirmation, but sacrificed most of the advantage radar provided. Scott chose aggression. All of the order Scott issued at approximately 23:30 hours would prove to be both tactically sound and operationally problematic. Execute a column turn to port, all ships turning left simultaneously, to position the formation perpendicular to the approaching contacts. The maneuver would cross the enemy's T if the contacts were Japanese, allowing all American guns to bear, while only Japanese lead ships could return fire. But the order created immediate confusion because the van destroyers, Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey, did not receive the signal clearly or misunderstood its timing. Destroyer captains, hearing "stand by to open fire," and now observing the cruisers beginning to turn, made independent judgments about what to do. Some attempted to conform to the column turn, others, believing they saw targets ahead, began maneuvering independently to attack. The carefully rehearsed formation discipline that Scott had spent months building began to fracture just as combat approached, undermining the coordination that was supposed to be Task Force 64's advantage against Japanese tactical superiority. The radar had provided the opportunity, but communication failures and human confusion were threatening to squander it. The 4 minutes between 23:28 and 23:32 hours on October 11, 1942, would be analyzed in after-action reports and naval staff studies for years afterward, representing a case study in how tactical advantage can be degraded through hesitation and communication failure. Norman Scott possessed information that should have guaranteed complete surprise. His radar had detected Japanese ships at 14 miles, while they remained oblivious to American presence. But doctrine required visual confirmation before opening fire, and Scott's uncertainty about whether the contacts might be American destroyers created delay that allowed Japanese forces to close the range by over 4,000 yards. The window of perfect surprise was narrowing with every passing minute, and decisions made in flag plot aboard San Francisco were determining whether radar's promise would be fulfilled or wasted. The confusion at the head of Scott's column was becoming acute as destroyer captains struggled to understand what was happening and what was expected of them. Commander Edmund Taylor, aboard USS. Duncan believed he had detected targets ahead and understood Scott's "stand by to open fire" as authorization to engage. At 23:30, Duncan increased speed and began moving out of formation toward what Taylor believed were Japanese ships. Aboard Fahrenholt and Laffey, captains were executing the column turn to port, but were uncertain whether they should maintain station or take independent action. The van destroyers, which in Scott's tactical plan were supposed to illuminate targets with searchlights once visual contact was made, were instead scattering, each captain making independent decisions based on incomplete information and conflicting interpretations of orders received. The rigid formation discipline Scott had drilled into his force was dissolving. At 23:32 hours, Scott ordered the column turn to port that would position his cruisers to cross the Japanese T. San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena began their turns in reasonable coordination, maintaining the column formation that was essential to Scott's fire plan. But the van destroyers were now in ambiguous positions. Duncan was charging ahead independently, while Fahrenholt and Laffey were attempting to conform to movements they hadn't fully understood. The result was that instead of a clean single-column formation, with destroyers providing screens at van and rear, Scott now had a partially coherent cruiser column, with destroyers scattered in positions where they might be either screening or might be directly in the line of fire. This was precisely the kind of confusion that Scott's training regime had been designed to prevent. But communications limitations and the stress of approaching combat had defeated systematic preparation. Aboard the Japanese flagship Aoba, the situation remained deceptively calm, despite the impending disaster. Lookouts continued their routine scans, seeing nothing that alarmed them. The cruiser maintained course and speed, approaching what officers still believed was an unopposed supply run to Guadalcanal. Admiral Goto was in his cabin rather than on the bridge, reviewing paperwork related to the unloading procedures that would be required at Guadalcanal. Gun crews were at cruising watch, not battle stations. The ship's watertight doors were not fully secured in the configuration that would maximize survivability if hit. This lack of preparation was not negligence. It was rational behavior based on the consistent experience of previous Tokyo Express runs, where American surface opposition had never materialized. The assumption of safety was about to be tested. At 23:33 hours, Japanese lookouts aboard Aoba suddenly spotted ships in the darkness ahead. American cruisers at approximately 5,000 yards, already in firing position. The shock of recognition was immediate and profound. Officers had seconds to process what they were seeing and understand that the routine mission had become a combat engagement against an enemy force that should not have been there. The first response was confusion rather than alarm, with some officers initially wondering if the ships might be friendly forces whose presence had not been communicated. But the positions and silhouettes quickly clarified that these were American cruisers in battle formation, and Aoba was steaming directly toward them at 30 knots with guns trained fore and aft rather than aimed for combat. The surprise was complete, but the time available to react was measured in seconds. The critical failure in Japanese tactical awareness was the assumption that no American surface force would be hunting them at night. This assumption had created a perceptual bias that made lookouts less likely to detect American ships even when they came into visual range. Lookouts were searching for PT boats, small, fast, low-silhouette targets, rather than for large cruisers in column formation. When American ships did appear, the initial reaction was disbelief rather than immediate tactical response. And precious seconds wasted as minds adjusted to a reality that contradicted expectations. This cognitive delay, combined with the physical reality that Aoba's guns were not aimed and crews were not at full battle stations, meant that even after detection, Japanese forces could not respond immediately with the kind of coordinated violence that had characterized their victory at Savo Island. USS Duncan's unauthorized charge toward the Japanese formation at 23:33 hours represented exactly the kind of aggressive independence that destroyer doctrine traditionally encouraged, but which Scott's tactical plan required be suppressed in favor of coordinated action. Commander Taylor aboard Duncan believed he was supporting what he thought was a destroyer torpedo attack, by demonstrating the initiative and offensive spirit that peacetime training had praised. But in the context of Scott's carefully choreographed plan, Duncan's action was catastrophic. She was now ahead of the American column, between the cruisers and the Japanese force, in a position where she would inevitably draw fire from both sides. Taylor's decision was not cowardice or incompetence. It was the result of incomplete information and a command culture that had not yet fully internalized the need for rigid discipline in night combat. The tension between individual initiative and formation discipline was about to be resolved in the worst possible way. The fundamental problem Scott faced was that his tactical plan required perfect execution and perfect communication, neither of which was achievable with the radio equipment and training available in October 1942. The TBS radio system was subject to interference, messages could be garbled or misunderstood, and the brevity required for tactical communication created ambiguity. Scott's orders needed to be both concise, to allow rapid transmission, and completely clear about intentions, an almost impossible combination when dealing with complex maneuvers involving multiple ships in darkness. The gap between what Scott intended and what his subordinates understood had created exactly the kind of confusion that Japanese night-fighting superiority had exploited at Savo Island. Radar had provided advantage, but command and control failures were threatening to negate it. By 23:33 hours and 30 seconds, the tactical situation had deteriorated from Scott's carefully planned ambush into a chaotic meeting engagement, where both sides were partially surprised and partially prepared. American cruisers were in reasonably good firing position, having completed their column turn and now presenting broadsides to the approaching Japanese column. But American destroyers were scattered out of position, creating both friendly fire dangers and gaps in the screening formation. Japanese ships had just detected American presence and were attempting to transition from cruising watch to battle stations, but they were caught in poor tactical formation and had lost the initiative. The advantage was American, but it was compromised advantage, less than what radar detection at 14 miles should have provided. The hesitation and confusion had cost Scott perhaps 3 minutes of perfect surprise, time enough for Japanese forces to close the range and detect American ships before the first shot was fired. The moment before combat began was characterized by a paradox that would define the battle's outcome. American forces had achieved strategic and tactical surprise through intelligence and radar, gaining position and detection advantage that should have been overwhelming. But operational execution had been flawed, with communication failures, formation breakdown, and hesitation degrading the advantage. Japanese forces were caught completely unprepared, surprised in a way that their doctrine said should be impossible. Yet their ships and weapons remained formidable, and their training might yet allow recovery even from disadvantage. Both sides were entering combat with significant vulnerabilities and significant strengths. The outcome would depend on which side could exploit enemy weaknesses faster while minimizing their own. The shooting was about to start, and the theoretical advantages of radar and preparation were about to be tested against the brutal reality of shells, torpedoes, and burning ships in darkness. At 23:46 hours on October 11th, 1942, USS Helena opened fire without waiting for Admiral Scott's order, her 6-inch guns erupting in a broadside that sent 15 shells arcing toward the Japanese cruiser, Aoba, at a range of approximately 5,000 yards. Captain Gilbert Hoover had made a decision that violated strict naval protocol, firing without explicit authorization from the force commander, but he had concluded that tactical necessity trumped procedural correctness. Helena's radar showed clear enemy contacts. Visual observers had confirmed Japanese ships in the darkness ahead, and Hoover believed that firing immediately was more important than waiting for an order that might come too late. The bright orange flashes of Helena's guns broke the darkness, and red tracers from her shells drew lines of fire across the night sky that every ship in both forces could see. The thunderclap of Helena's opening salvo triggered immediate response from other American ships whose gun crews had been tensely waiting for combat to begin. USS Boise opened fire within 30 seconds, her 15 6-inch guns joining Helena's barrage. Salt Lake City's 8-inch guns followed moments later, each shell weighing 260 pounds and capable of penetrating cruiser armor at this range. Within 90 seconds of Helena's first salvo, all 4 American cruisers were firing, creating a weight of metal in the air that Japanese forces had never experienced in a night engagement. The combined broadside represented 36 main battery guns firing at maximum rate, and the volume of fire was devastating. Shells began impacting Aoba before her crew could even reach battle stations, transforming what seconds earlier had been a routine steaming watch into a nightmare of explosions and fire. The Japanese flagship Aoba absorbed the brunt of the American barrage with catastrophic effect. Shells struck her bridge, its superstructure, and upper works in rapid succession. Historical records suggest over 40 hits in the first 90 seconds of combat. The bridge was demolished, killing or wounding most officers present. Admiral Goto, caught in the open when the American barrage began, was struck by shell fragments and mortally wounded. His last words, according to Japanese survivors, were spoken in confusion. "Bakugeki ka?" Is it an air attack? He died without fully understanding that he was in a surface engagement, his mind unable to process that American cruisers were engaging Japanese forces at night in a coordinated ambush. Fire control stations were destroyed, communication systems severed, and flames began spreading from ruptured fuel lines and ignited ready ammunition. The American gunnery performance in the opening minutes of the battle exceeded what peacetime exercises had suggested was possible for night combat. Hit rates of approximately 30% were being achieved, far better than the 10 to 15% that was typical for night surface action. Multiple factors contributed to this accuracy. The range was short enough that even in darkness, visual spotting was possible once muzzle flashes revealed target positions. American gun crews had trained extensively, and the muscle memory of loading, aiming, and firing was functioning despite stress and darkness. Ships were firing in coordinated salvos with overlapping impact zones, making it difficult for Japanese ships to maneuver clear of the fire. And perhaps most critically, Japanese ships were not taking evasive action because they had been caught completely by surprise, steaming in straight lines that made gunnery calculations straightforward. But the violence that American cruisers unleashed was not directed solely at enemy targets. At approximately 23:48 hours, American shells began striking USS Fahrenholt and USS Duncan, both of which were forward of the cruiser line and silhouetted against the distant flashes of Japanese ships. The friendly fire was inevitable given the tactical confusion. American cruisers were firing at any target visible in the darkness ahead, and the van destroyers were in that darkness, in positions where they appeared to be enemy vessels. Fahrenholt was hit by at least 5 shells, likely from American 8-inch guns, or suffering casualties and damage to her superstructure. Duncan, already charging toward Japanese forces, was caught in crossfire from both American and Japanese guns, hit by shells from multiple directions simultaneously. The command and control breakdown that had scattered the van destroyers was now causing exactly the catastrophe that careful formation discipline was supposed to prevent. At 23:49 hours, Admiral Scott made a decision driven by the horrifying realization that American ships were firing on each other. He ordered ceasefire, transmitting the command via TBS radio in an attempt to stop the friendly fire carnage. But the ceasefire order created its own problems. Some ships received the order and complied immediately, and their guns falling silent even as Japanese ships were still in range and still viable targets. Other ships did not receive the order clearly or chose to ignore it, continuing to fire at targets they believed were legitimately enemy vessels. The result was that American fire became sporadic and uncoordinated, just as Japanese ships were beginning to recover from initial surprise and return fire. The ceasefire order was necessary to prevent American ships from destroying each other, but its implementation was imperfect, and its tactical effect was to reduce the weight of fire on Japanese forces at a critical moment. The heavy cruiser Furutaka, second in the Japanese column, had absorbed nearly as much punishment as Aoba in the opening minutes. Shells struck her superstructure, penetrated her deck armor, and started fires that her damage control parties struggled to contain. Unlike Aoba, which had been effectively crippled in the first salvo, Furutaka remained partially capable of fighting back. Her gun crews managed to return fire despite the chaos, and her torpedo crews prepared to launch the long-lance torpedoes that might yet turn the battle. But Furutaka had been hit repeatedly. Historical accounts suggest over 20 impacts from American 6-inch and 8-inch shells, and her ability to maneuver was degraded. Fires burning in her superstructure provided a beacon that made her an easy target for continued American fire. The cruiser was dying, but she was not yet dead, and Japanese training emphasized fighting to the last, even from a sinking ship. The destroyer Fubuki, screening the Japanese cruiser column, had found herself in perhaps the most exposed position of any ship in either force. American cruiser fire that missed the cruisers behind Fubuki inevitably struck the destroyer, and she began absorbing hits from shells intended for larger targets. The destroyer's light armor provided no protection against 6-inch and 8-inch shells, and each hit did devastating damage. But Fubuki's captain, demonstrating the aggressive spirit that characterized Japanese destroyer doctrine, turned directly toward the American column and increased speed, charging at what appeared to be suicidal odds in an attempt to close to torpedo range. The destroyer's 5-inch guns returned fire as she charged, her shells splashing near American cruisers, but achieving no significant hits. She was outgunned, outnumbered, and already burning. But she was attacking rather than fleeing, embodying the Japanese naval philosophy that honor demanded offensive action, even against impossible odds. By 23:50 hours, 4 minutes after Helena's opening salvo, the tactical situation had evolved into something neither admiral had planned or anticipated. American forces had achieved devastating surprise and inflicted severe damage on Japanese flagship and second cruiser, but friendly fire and the ceasefire order had disrupted coordinated fire. Japanese forces had been caught unprepared and severely damaged, but were beginning to fight back with guns and were preparing torpedo attacks. Both formations were now intermixed in darkness at close range, with ships from both sides moving through the same waters. Making target identification difficult and friendly fire a constant danger. The careful plans of both admirals had dissolved into a melee where individual ship captains were making their own decisions about targets, maneuvering, and weapons employment. The wall of fire that American cruisers had created in the opening minutes had smashed Japanese formations and inflicted grievous damage, but it had not achieved the clean, decisive victory that Scott's tactical plan had envisioned. The battle was far from over, and the Japanese were about to demonstrate that even severely damaged ships could strike back with devastating effect. The heavy cruiser Furutaka, already hit by more than 20 American shells and burning in multiple locations, these launched a full spread of 8 Type 93 long-lance torpedoes at approximately 2350 hours on October 11, 1942. The torpedoes entered the water traveling at 36 knots, their oxygen-fueled engines leaving almost no visible wake as they raced toward the American column. Each torpedo carried over 1,000 pounds of high explosive in a warhead designed to break a ship's keel, and the spread pattern was calculated to cover the expected positions of multiple American cruisers. The torpedo launch represented Japanese tactical doctrine at its purest. Even from a dying ship, wreathed in flames and clearly doomed, the crew's final action was to strike back at the enemy with the most powerful weapons available. Furutaka would not survive the battle. But her torpedoes might yet inflict casualties that would balance the scales. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo embodied technological priorities that differed fundamentally from American design philosophy. Where American torpedoes emphasized reliability and were consequently limited in range and speed, Japanese designers had pursued maximum lethality, even at the cost of complexity and occasional malfunction. The oxygen-fueled engine was dangerous to manufacture and maintain. Pure oxygen was volatile, and accidents during loading had killed Japanese sailors in peacetime training, but it provided range and speed that no contemporary torpedo could match. The 24-inch diameter allowed a warhead 3 times the size of American torpedoes, and creating explosive force sufficient to sink a battleship with a single hit under favorable circumstances. American intelligence in October 1942 still underestimated long-lance capabilities, not fully understanding why Japanese torpedoes were proving so devastating in battle after battle. Destroyer Fubuki, charging toward American lines while absorbing hits from multiple cruisers, launched her own torpedoes at 23:51 hours from a range of approximately 3,000 yards. The destroyer was already severely damaged, her superstructure a mass of flames, and her forward gun mount destroyed, but her torpedo tubes remained operational. The captain aimed the spread toward the center of the American column, where radar would have shown the largest concentration of ships. Fubuki's charge was both tactically sound and personally suicidal, closing to point-blank range maximized torpedo hit probability, but exposed the destroyer to overwhelming fire. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized that a destroyer's primary mission was to deliver torpedo attacks even at the cost of the ship itself, and Fubuki's captain was executing that doctrine with lethal precision even as his ship disintegrated around him. Aboard USS Boise at 23:52 hours, a lookout spotted phosphorescent wakes in the water to port. Long-lance torpedoes running past at close range. Captain Edward Moran immediately ordered emergency turn to starboard, attempting to parallel the torpedo tracks and minimize target profile. The cruiser heeled sharply as her rudder went hard over. And sailors aboard later reported seeing at least 3 torpedoes pass within 50 feet of the hull, close enough that the turbulence from their passage was visible in the dark water. The near miss was a matter of seconds and yards. If Boise had maintained her previous course, at least one torpedo would almost certainly have struck. The margin between survival and catastrophe was the narrow, decided by a lookout's sharp eyes and a captain's instant reaction. The challenge American ships faced in detecting and evading Japanese torpedoes was profound and had no easy solution. Long-lance torpedoes ran nearly wakeless, making visual detection extremely difficult even for trained lookouts. American ships lacked the sonar equipment that might have provided warning of torpedoes in the water. The first indication was usually seeing the phosphorescent wake, by which time evasion was a matter of luck as much as skill. Ships could maneuver, but at night in close quarters with friendly ships nearby, radical maneuvering created collision dangers nearly as serious as torpedo threat. Captains had to balance the need to dodge torpedoes against the need to maintain some predictability in their movements, so other American ships could avoid hitting them. It was an impossible calculus with no correct answer, and different captains made different choices. The Japanese cruiser Kinugasa, third in the original column and the least damaged of Goto's heavy cruisers, began returning fire with coordinated salvos at 23:53 hours. Her 8-inch guns targeted USS Boise, which was illuminated by fires burning on other ships, and therefore easier to see in the darkness. Kinugasa's gunnery was reasonably accurate despite the chaos. Japanese gun crews had trained extensively for night combat, and their optical rangefinders were functioning effectively at the current range of approximately 6,000 yards. Shells began falling around Boise, splashes visible even in darkness as 260-pound projectiles impacted the water. Some shells missed by yards rather than hundreds of yards, indicating that Japanese fire control was achieving target solutions despite the confusion and darkness. At 23:55 hours, Japanese destroyers Hatsuyuki and the damaged Fubuki began laying smokescreens, creating a white chemical fog that obscured visual observation and complicated American gunnery. The smoke was a standard Japanese tactical response to unfavorable engagement conditions. When outnumbered or outgunned, destroyers would create concealment, allowing larger ships to break contact and escape. The smoke worked effectively, creating barriers that made it difficult for American optical rangefinders to track targets. But smoke cut both ways. It also prevented Japanese gunners from seeing American ships clearly, degrading their own fire control. The tactical situation was deteriorating into mutual blindness, with neither side able to maintain clear picture of enemy positions or movements. USS Salt Lake City continued engaging targets throughout this period, her 8-inch guns firing at Japanese cruisers whenever targets were visible through the smoke and darkness. The heavy cruiser's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Arning, was coordinating fire with determination and skill, attempting to maintain systematic target engagement even as the tactical situation dissolved into chaos. Salt Lake City's gun crews were performing superbly, loading, aiming, and firing, with the rhythm that extensive training had developed. But unknown to the officers on the bridge, Salt Lake City had been hit below the waterline by a Japanese 8-inch shell at approximately 23:49 hours. The shell had penetrated the hull plating forward of the engine room, creating an 8-inch hole through which seawater was flooding into the ship. Damage control parties were working to contain the flooding, but over 1,000 tons of water had already entered the hull, creating a list to port that would eventually require speed reduction. As by 23:58 hours, the destroyer Fubuki had absorbed so much damage that she could no longer maintain way. The forward section of the ship was engulfed in the flames. Her main deck was buckled from shell impacts, and flooding from underwater hits was overwhelming her pumps. The captain ordered abandon ship, and crew members began entering the water as the destroyer began to list heavily to starboard. Fubuki would sink at approximately midnight, taking most of her crew with her. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized fighting until the ship could not float, rather than abandoning while still capable of combat. The destroyer had achieved her mission by launching torpedoes and drawing American fire away from the cruisers, but the cost was total loss of the ship and most of her crew. The sacrifice demonstrated both the effectiveness and the brutality of Japanese naval tactics. The paradox of the battle's first 15 minutes was that American forces had achieved devastating tactical success. 2 Japanese cruisers heavily damaged, 1 destroyer sinking, flagship's command staff killed, while simultaneously suffering from problems that undermined the completeness of victory. Friendly fire had damaged American destroyers and forced a ceasefire order that disrupted American gunnery coordination. Japanese torpedo attacks had very nearly hit American cruisers, despite Japanese forces being surprised and heavily damaged. The tactical discipline that Scott had worked so hard to establish had partially broken down in the chaos of actual combat. American forces were winning, but winning messily and incompletely, and achieving success despite flaws rather than because of perfect execution. The dragon's teeth that Japanese forces planted with their torpedo attacks had not yet hit American ships, but dozens of long-lance torpedoes were still running through the dark water, and the battle was far from over. USS Duncan charged toward the Japanese formation at 23:33 hours. Her captain commander, Edmund Taylor, believing he was supporting what he thought was a destroyer torpedo attack already in progress. Taylor was a Naval Academy graduate with a reputation for aggressive leadership, the kind of destroyer officer who preferred action to contemplation and who embodied the offensive spirit that destroyer doctrine traditionally praised. But in the context of Norman Scott's carefully planned formation tactics, a Duncan's independent action was catastrophic. She was racing ahead of American cruisers, directly into the zone where both American and Japanese forces would soon be firing at anything that moved. Taylor did not know he was making a fatal mistake because he lacked complete information about Scott's tactical plan and the actual positions of all forces involved. He saw what appeared to be enemy ships, heard orders to stand by to engage, and made the aggressive choice that his training had prepared him to make. At 23:47 hours, Duncan illuminated the Japanese cruiser Furutaka with her searchlight, creating a brilliant beam that pierced the darkness and allowed her gun crews to acquire a clear target. The searchlight tactic was doctrinally correct. Destroyers were supposed to illuminate targets for cruiser gunnery. But the illumination also revealed Duncan's own position to every ship in both forces, making her instantly visible and immediately vulnerable. Within seconds, both Japanese and American guns were firing at Duncan. She was caught in crossfire from ships ahead and behind, from enemies she intended to engage and friends who did not recognize her as friendly. The destroyer began absorbing hits from multiple directions simultaneously. Japanese 8-inch shells from Furutaka ahead, American 8-inch shells from Salt Lake City behind, with smaller caliber fire from various sources adding to the devastation. The damage Duncan suffered in the first 2 minutes of combat was catastrophic and irreparable. An 8-inch shell penetrated her forward fire room at 23:47 hours and 30 seconds, and destroying the boilers that provided steam for her forward engine and killing every man in the compartment. Steam lines ruptured, filling adjacent spaces with superheated vapor that scalded sailors attempting damage control. Another shell struck the main deck aft, penetrating into the after engine room and flooding that space as well. Within 3 minutes of opening fire, Duncan had lost propulsion in both engine rooms, her speed dropping from 30 knots to bare steerage way. The ship was dead in the water, burning, flooding, and still under fire from ships that could see her flames, but could not identify whether she was friend or enemy. Commander Taylor attempted to maintain control, even as his ship disintegrated around him. From the bridge, he could see fires spreading, could hear reports of flooding in the engine spaces, or could feel the ship losing way and beginning to list. He ordered damage control parties to fight the fires and authorize flooding of the forward magazine to prevent a catastrophic explosion if flames reached the stored powder. The magazine flooding decision was tactically sound, but confirmed that Duncan was finished as a fighting unit. Ships only flooded their magazines when they were beyond saving. Taylor remained on the bridge attempting to coordinate damage control, refusing to abandon ship while any crew members remained aboard. His leadership in those final minutes was exemplary, even though his earlier tactical decision had been disastrous. At midnight on October 12, 1942, Duncan's list to starboard had increased to approximately 30 degrees, and the ship was clearly sinking. Taylor gave the order to abandon ship, and crew members began entering the water. The sea temperature was warm, tropical waters near Guadalcanal, but the darkness was absolute, and men struggled to find anything to hold on to as they floated away from the sinking destroyer. Life rafts had been damaged in the bombardment, and many sailors had only their life jackets to keep them afloat. Sharks were a known hazard in these waters, and the sound of splashing and the smell of blood would attract them. Surviving until rescue arrived would require luck, determination, and the kind of physical endurance that training could not fully prepare men for. At 0200 hours on October 12th, Duncan rolled completely onto her starboard side and sank bow first into Iron Bottom Sound. She settled in approximately 600 feet of water, joining the wrecks of Quincy, Astoria, Vincennes, and Canberra already lying on the seafloor from the August battle. Of Duncan's crew of 195 officers and men, only 48 survived to be rescued. Commander Taylor was not among the survivors. He was last seen on the bridge as the ship rolled over, having refused to abandon until all other crew members had left. His body was never recovered. The destroyer had been in combat for approximately 15 minutes from the moment she charged ahead of the American column until she sank, a brief and brutal span that destroyed the ship and killed 3/4 of her crew. The post-battle court of inquiry into Duncan's loss would conclude that Commander Taylor had acted on aggressive initiative, but with inadequate information about the tactical situation. The finding was diplomatic, but captured a fundamental tension in destroyer doctrine. The emphasis on aggressive action was appropriate in many tactical situations, but could be catastrophic when it conflicted with the need for formation discipline in night combat. Taylor had made decisions that would have been praised in daylight fleet action, but were disastrous in the context of Scott's coordinated night fighting plan. The court did not assign blame, because blame seemed beside the point when both the commander and most of his crew were dead. Instead, the inquiry focused on lessons about communication, formation discipline, and the need for clearer command and control procedures in night surface action. The friendly fire that contributed to Duncan's destruction represented a failure mode that American forces had not adequately prepared for. Scott's tactical plan had assumed that maintaining formation discipline would prevent American ships from firing at each other, but the plan had not accounted for the possibility that destroyers might break formation in the confusion of first contact. Once Duncan was out of position, forward of the cruiser line, and silhouetted against enemy ships, she became visually indistinguishable from Japanese destroyers to American gunners who were firing at any target in the darkness ahead. The technical solution, installation of identification equipment that could distinguish friend from foe, did not exist in October 1942. The only solution was better discipline, clearer communications, and more realistic training about the dangers of independent action in night combat. For the 48 Duncan survivors floating in the dark water, the immediate concern was not tactical lessons, but simple survival. They could hear the battle continuing in the distance. Gun flashes, explosions, the sound of ships maneuvering at high speed. But they were alone in the darkness, scattered across hundreds of yards of ocean, struggling to find each other and to stay afloat until rescue could arrive. Some men called out, trying to group together for mutual support. Others remained silent, fearing that sound might attract sharks, or that their voices might carry to Japanese ships. The wait for rescue would last over 6 hours, and not all survivors would live to see dawn. Hypothermia was unlikely in warm tropical waters, but exhaustion, injuries, and shark attacks would claim additional lives before American patrol boats finally located the scattered survivors in the early morning hours. And Duncan's destruction illuminated a harsh truth about night surface combat that theoretical planning had not fully captured. The difference between training exercises and actual battle was so profound that even excellent preparation might prove inadequate. Duncan's crew was well trained, her captain was experienced and aggressive, her ship was in good material condition. None of that had been sufficient to prevent disaster when tactical confusion and command breakdown put her in an impossible position. The destroyer's sacrifice had some value. She had drawn Japanese fire and had briefly illuminated targets for American cruisers, but the cost was vastly disproportionate to any contribution she made to American victory. The 48 survivors who eventually reached safety carried knowledge purchased at terrible price. That in night combat, individual heroism was no substitute for formation discipline, and aggressive initiative could transform into lethal liabilities in the span of seconds. USS Boise steamed through the battle at 23 knots, her 15 6-inch guns firing in coordinated salvos at Japanese cruisers visible in the darkness ahead. The light cruiser had been performing superbly in the first 15 minutes of combat, her gunnery accurate and her damage control organization functioning smoothly under the leadership of Captain Edward Moran. Boise's crew had been at battle stations since before first contact, and the ship's material condition was excellent. Watertight integrity was set. Damage control parties were positioned at critical locations throughout the ship. Ammunition supply chains were functioning efficiently. From a tactical standpoint, Boise was doing everything right, executing Scott's fire plan and contributing significantly to the weight of fire that had devastated Japanese flagship and second cruiser. But naval combat has a random component that no amount of preparation can eliminate, and at 0001 hours on October 12, 1942, Boise's luck ran out. 3 Japanese 8-inch shells from the cruiser Kinugasa struck Boise's forward section in rapid succession between 0001 and 0002 hours. The shells came in at a relatively flat trajectory, having been fired from a range of approximately 6,000 yards, and they possessed tremendous kinetic energy. The first shell penetrated the deck armor protecting Boise's number 1 turret, detonated in the handling room where powder bags were stored, and created a flash fire that instantly killed every man in that compartment. The second and third shells struck number 2's turret, penetrating through the turret face and detonating inside the gunhouse and in the handling room below. The explosions created instant overpressure that blew out hatches and doors, venting flame down through the magazine access trunks toward the powder magazines themselves. The temperature in the forward magazine spaces spiked from ambient temperature to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 30 seconds as powder bags ignited. The flash fire was every naval officer's nightmare, the explosive combustion of gunpowder in confined spaces, creating temperatures and pressures that could detonate entire magazines and destroy ships in catastrophic explosions. Now, Boise's forward magazines contained approximately 80 tons of powder and shells, sufficient explosive force to break the ship in half if they detonated sympathetically. The ship was approximately 90 seconds away from the kind of catastrophic magazine explosion that had destroyed HMS Hood the previous year, killing all but 3 of her crew of over 1,400 men. Whether Boise would survive or join Hood, as another example of magazine vulnerability, depended entirely on what happened in the next 2 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hall led a damage control party into the forward magazine area at 0002 hours, knowing that entering those spaces likely meant death, but recognizing that someone had to flood the magazines before complete detonation occurred. Boas Hall and his team opened watertight doors into compartments filled with smoke, flame, and burning hydraulic oil, wading waist-deep through flaming liquid to reach the manual magazine flooding valves. The flooding system could be activated from the bridge, but the piping had been damaged by shell impacts and the system was not responding to remote activation. Manual operation required going into the magazine spaces themselves and physically opening the large bronze valves that would admit seawater. Hall and his men were effectively volunteering to die if they could not open the valves and escape before the magazines exploded. The act of opening the magazine flooding valves while standing in burning oil in a compartment where powder was already burning required physical courage almost impossible to comprehend for anyone who has not faced similar circumstances. The temperature was approaching levels that made breathing difficult, even through wet rags held over mouths. Skin was blistering from radiant heat. The noise was overwhelming, roaring flames, exploding powder bags, rushing water as valves opened, screams from men whose clothing had ignited. Hall and several members of his party received burns so severe that their survival was doubtful, even if the ship itself survived. But they remained at their posts, ensuring the valves were fully open and seawater was flooding into the magazines at maximum rate, all diluting and cooling the powder before it could mass detonate. At 0004 hours, approximately 3 minutes after the Japanese shells struck, seawater had flooded both forward magazines to a depth sufficient to suppress further combustion. The temperature began dropping rapidly as water absorbed heat and starved the fires of oxygen. The immediate crisis was past. Boise would not explode, but the cost had been devastating. The forward magazine spaces were flooded with approximately 300 tons of seawater, creating severe lists to port that required counter-flooding to stabilize. Both forward turrets were disabled, their guns pointing at random angles and their crews either dead or burned. Fires continued burning in the superstructure forward of the bridge, and the casualty count was horrifying. 107 men dead. Now, most of them killed in the initial shell impacts and flash fires, with an additional 35 seriously wounded, including members of Hall's damage control party. Captain Moran faced a decision at 0006 hours that was both tactically clear and emotionally difficult. Boise was combat ineffective. Half her main battery was destroyed. She was flooding badly. Fires were burning in multiple compartments, and over 100 of her crew were dead. Remaining in the battle risked further damage that might sink the ship entirely. But withdrawing meant abandoning the task force while combat continued, a decision that could be interpreted as cowardice despite the legitimate tactical and humanitarian reasons for retreat. Moran chose survival over honor, all ordering Boise to break off from the formation and withdraw southwest at maximum speed, compatible with damage. The decision was correct, but Moran knew it would be scrutinized carefully in after-action reviews. Captains who withdrew from battle, regardless of circumstances, always faced questions about their courage and judgment. The magazine flooding that saved Boise's hull highlighted a critical vulnerability in American cruiser design that naval architects had not fully appreciated. The proximity of powder magazines to turret handling rooms meant that penetrating hits on turrets could rapidly propagate into magazine spaces, and the thin deck armor over magazines provided inadequate protection against plunging fire. Japanese cruiser design had similar vulnerabilities, but Japanese doctrine emphasized torpedo attack over sustained gun duels, meaning Japanese cruisers were less likely to remain in gun range long enough to suffer multiple hits. American doctrine emphasized gunnery superiority through volume of fire, which required American cruisers to remain in gun range, exposing them to accumulating hits that might eventually penetrate to critical spaces. The design and doctrine combination created vulnerability that Boise had nearly demonstrated in the most catastrophic possible way. Lieutenant Commander Hall would be awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his actions in flooding Boise's magazines. He died of his burns several days after the battle, never recovering consciousness after collapsing from his injuries. Multiple members of his damage control party also received decorations, and some posthumously, recognizing that they had saved the ship and hundreds of lives through actions that cost them their own lives. The awards and recognition could not change the fundamental tragedy that a well-fought ship had been nearly destroyed, that over 100 men had died, that families would receive telegrams informing them of losses that the formal language of official notification could never adequately describe. Boise had survived, but survival came at a price that made victory feel hollow to the men who had watched their shipmates burn. As Boise withdrew from the battle at 0010 hours, her decks forward of the bridge remained a scene of devastation. Firefighting parties were still combating blazes in the superstructure. Medical teams were overwhelmed with burn victims requiring immediate treatment. The ship's list to port had been partially corrected by counter-flooding, but was still pronounced enough to make movement difficult. And below decks in the flooded magazine spaces, the bodies of men who had died instantly when Japanese shells detonated remained in the dark water, beyond immediate recovery. The ship would make port, would be repaired, would fight again. But she would carry scars both physical and psychological from the night of October 11th, 1942, when the margin between survival and catastrophic loss had been measured in seconds and in the courage of men willing to walk into fire, knowing they would not walk out. USS Salt Lake City maintained her position in the American battle line throughout the engagement, in her 8-inch guns firing with mechanical precision that reflected months of gunnery training and the calm professionalism of her crew. From 23:46 hours when the battle began until 0010 hours when the heaviest fighting subsided, Salt Lake City fired 271 8-inch shells at Japanese targets, more than any other American ship in the battle. Her gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Arning, coordinated fire with systematic efficiency, designating targets, calculating firing solutions, directing salvos with the methodical approach that made Salt Lake City's gun crews among the most effective in the task force. But while Arning and the gun crews focused on destroying enemy ships, the damage that Salt Lake City had suffered early in the engagement was slowly undermining the cruiser's combat capability in ways that would not become apparent until the battle's final phase. At 23:49 hours during the opening minutes of the engagement, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck Salt Lake City at the waterline on her port side, penetrating the hull plating and creating an 8-inch diameter hole approximately 4 feet below the nominal waterline. The shell did not detonate. It was either a dud or it punched completely through the ship and exited the starboard side without fuse activation. But the hole it created allowed seawater to flood into the forward engine room, entering at a rate that overwhelmed the bilge pump's capacity. The damage was not immediately recognized because attention was focused on gunnery operations, and because the flooding occurred in spaces where water accumulation was not instantly visible to personnel on watch. By the time damage control parties recognized the problem, at approximately 0005 hours, over 1,200 tons of seawater had already entered the hull. The effect of flooding on Salt Lake City's performance was gradual but progressive. The additional weight in the forward sections created a bow-down trim that increased resistance and reduced maximum speed. The list to port, initially slight, gradually increased as water accumulated and began shifting with the ship's movement. By 0010 hours, the cruiser had developed a 5-degree list that made gun operations more difficult and created psychological concern among crew members who could feel the ship's abnormal attitude. Captain Ernest Small faced a decision similar to what Captain Moran had confronted aboard Boise, whether to continue fighting or withdraw to control damage. Small chose to remain engaged, ordering damage control parties to contain the flooding, while gun crews continued firing. The decision was aggressive and arguably risky, but Small believed Salt Lake City could continue contributing to the battle even while damaged. The flooding control efforts aboard Salt Lake City demonstrated the effectiveness of well-trained damage control doctrine, even under combat conditions. Damage control parties located the hull penetration using systematic search procedures and identifying the flooding source by tracking water flow patterns and pressure readings. They attempted to plug the hole using wooden shoring and mattresses, traditional damage control techniques that sometimes worked and sometimes failed, depending on water pressure and hole configuration. When plugging proved ineffective, they established portable pumping capacity using equipment staged for exactly this purpose, creating additional pumping beyond the ship's fixed bilge system. The flooding was not stopped entirely, but it was slowed to a rate where pumping capacity roughly equaled inflow, preventing further accumulation. This was damage control at its best, improvisation, determination, and technical skill combining to keep a damaged ship fighting. Lieutenant Commander Arning's gunnery performance throughout the battle exemplified the principle that systematic training could produce effective combat results even in chaotic conditions. Arning maintained target discipline, ensuring that Salt Lake City's guns engaged designated targets rather than firing at random contacts. He coordinated salvos to maximize hit probability, using the optical rangefinders and fire control computers that American cruisers carried. He communicated with other ships to coordinate fire and avoid wasting ammunition on targets that other ships were already engaging effectively. The result was that Salt Lake City's 271 shells contributed disproportionately to Japanese losses. Post-battle analysis would credit her with critical damage to both Furutaka and Kinugasa, hits that contributed directly to one sinking and one severe crippling. Captain Small's philosophy of maintaining aggressive engagement, even while damaged, reflected a command style that prioritized mission accomplishment over ship preservation within the bounds of reasonable risk. Small understood that Salt Lake City could sink if flooding got worse, or if additional damage occurred. But he also understood that the tactical situation required every American gun to remain in action to ensure Japanese forces were defeated decisively. The balance between prudent caution and aggressive action was difficult to calculate in real time, and different captains made different choices. And Small's choice to keep fighting while damaged was vindicated by results. Salt Lake City survived and contributed significantly to victory, but the same choice in slightly different circumstances might have led to the ship's loss. The crew's response to combat and damage reflected the psychological resilience that American sailors had developed despite earlier defeats. Men who had heard about Savo Island and understood that American forces had a losing record in night surface combat might have responded to damage with panic or defeatism. Instead, Salt Lake City's crew responded with disciplined professionalism, manning their stations, following procedures, trusting their training and their leaders. Gun crews continued loading and firing even knowing their ship was flooding. The damage control parties worked in flooded compartments exposed to potential additional shell hits. Engine room personnel maintained steam production despite water lapping at machinery foundations. The performance was not superhuman, It was simply competent men doing difficult jobs under stress, which is the foundation of military effectiveness. By 0015 hours, Salt Lake City had transitioned from offensive combat operations to a more balanced posture that emphasized damage control equally with continued engagement. Gun crews maintained readiness to fire if targets appeared, but rate of fire had decreased as ammunition supply became more difficult with the ship's bow-down trim. Ice speed had been reduced to 18 knots to minimize stress on damaged hull structure, and to reduce bow wave that might force more water through the hull penetration. The list to port had been partially corrected through counter-flooding, though this added more weight to a ship already low in the water from the initial flooding. Salt Lake City remained combat-capable, but was operating at reduced effectiveness, a wounded ship that continued fighting because her captain and crew refused to quit, while Japanese forces remained in contact. The comparison between Salt Lake City's damage and Boise's damage illustrated how random factors influenced combat outcomes. Both ships had been hit by Japanese 8-inch shells, but the specific locations and effects were vastly different. At Boise's hit struck magazines and created flash fires that nearly destroyed the ship and killed over 100 men. Salt Lake City's hit penetrated below the waterline and created flooding that was serious but manageable. The difference was not in the quality of damage control or crew performance. It was simply where the shells happened to strike. This randomness was characteristic of naval combat, where fractional variations in shell trajectory could mean the difference between minor damage and catastrophic loss. Commanders could control tactics, training, and preparation, but they could not control the physics of where shells actually impacted once they left the gun. As the battle entered its final phase after 0015 hours, Salt Lake City continued steaming with the American formation. Now her guns available if needed, but her primary focus shifting to reaching friendly port facilities where permanent repairs could be made. The cruiser had earned her place in the victory. Her gunnery had been outstanding. Her damage control had been effective. Her crew had performed with distinction. But she had also demonstrated vulnerability, showing that even well-fought ships could be damaged, and that damage control, however skillful, could not always prevent degraded capability. The gauntlet Salt Lake City had run through Japanese shells and torpedoes had been survived, but survival came with costs measured in flooded compartments, reduced speed, and the knowledge that different luck with shell impacts might have produced very different outcomes. At 0030 hours on October 12, 1942, the Admiral Norman Scott aboard USS San Francisco attempted to assess the tactical situation as the intensity of gunfire gradually diminished across the battle area. The confusion that had characterized the engagement's opening minutes had not fully resolved. Ships from both forces were scattered across several miles of ocean. Smoke and darkness obscured visual observation, and radio reports from various American captains provided conflicting information about damage, casualties, and enemy positions. Scott knew that Japanese flagship Aoba had been severely damaged and that at least one Japanese destroyer appeared to be sinking, but he could not determine with certainty how many enemy ships remained combat effective, or whether they were withdrawing or regrouping for continued action. The fundamental problem of night surface combat, that commanders fought partially blind, never possessing complete picture of the tactical situation, remained unsolved despite radar's advantages. The approaching dawn created time pressure that affected both forces equally, but with different strategic implications. Sunrise on October 12th would occur at 0545 hours, approximately 5 hours away. American aircraft from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal would begin operating shortly after dawn, providing air superiority that could devastate any Japanese ships still in the area. But those same 5 hours represented vulnerability for damaged American ships. If Japanese forces could locate cripples like Boise and Salt Lake City, they might inflict additional damage before dawn brought safety. Scott needed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: continue hunting Japanese forces to prevent them from delivering their supplies to Guadalcanal, protect his own damaged ships from further attack, rescue survivors from Duncan and possibly other ships whose fate remained uncertain, and position his force to be beyond Japanese land-based air attack range by full daylight. The competing demands were difficult to balance. Japanese destroyer Hatsuyuki, undamaged and still combat effective, was engaged in rescue operations at 0100 hours, pulling survivors from the sunken destroyer Fubuki from the dark water. The rescue work proceeded under sporadic American fire. Several American ships could see the destroyer's silhouette and were shooting at her, though accuracy was poor in darkness and at long range. Hatsuyuki's captain faced an impossible choice between humanitarian duty to rescue shipmates and tactical prudence to avoid becoming another casualty. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized that ships should continue fighting or withdraw to fight another day, and that rescue operations should not be conducted under fire unless critical circumstances demanded it. But leaving men in the water when rescue was possible violated the bonds between sailors that transcended doctrine. Hatsuyuki remained in the area for 20 additional minutes, rescuing 195 Japanese sailors from Fubuki and Furutaka before finally withdrawing northwest under smokescreen. American destroyer operations after 0100 hours focused on locating and rescuing survivors from USS Duncan, scattered across several miles of ocean in the darkness. The patrol boats and destroyers assigned to rescue operations faced the same humanitarian versus tactical conflict that troubled Hatsuyuki's captain. Rescuing survivors was imperative, but searching in darkness in waters where Japanese forces might still be present created risk of additional casualties. Destroyer captains proceeded cautiously, using searchlights sporadically to illuminate search areas while maintaining lookouts watching for potential Japanese torpedo attacks. The survivors had been in the water for over an hour by 0200 hours when the first rescue boats arrived, and hypothermia was beginning to affect even those wearing life jackets in the warm tropical water. 48 Duncan crew members would eventually be recovered, but the rescue operations would continue until 0400 hours before commanders were confident all surviving swimmers had been located. The damaged ships Boise and Salt Lake City were making their way south at reduced speed, attempting to clear the combat area and establish distance from potential Japanese reinforcements. Boise was trailing a visible wake from her flooding, and her forward section showed obvious fire damage even in darkness. She was vulnerable and clearly in distress. Salt Lake City maintained better speed and appeared less damaged externally, but her flooding continued despite pumping efforts, and her bow-down trim was becoming more pronounced. Both cruisers were shadowed by destroyers, providing anti-submarine and anti-surface screening. But the screening force was thin because Scott needed most of his destroyers to maintain cohesion in his battle line. The mathematics of force allocation were unforgiving. Scott lacked enough ships to simultaneously hunt Japanese forces, protect damaged cruisers, and conduct rescue operations. Something had to be compromised, and Scott chose to emphasize hunting over protection, calculating that the best way to ensure his damaged ships survived was to finish destroying Japanese capability to threaten them. At 0300 hours, radar contacts indicated Japanese ships withdrawing northwest toward the Shortland Islands. Scott briefly considered pursuit, but decided against it, in concluding that following Japanese forces toward their bases would expose his formation to land-based air attack at dawn and might lead into ambush by fresh Japanese forces. The decision to break off contact was tactically conservative but strategically sound. Scott had accomplished his primary mission of preventing Japanese supplies from reaching Guadalcanal, had inflicted severe damage on enemy cruisers, and had proven American forces could fight effectively at night. Pursuing damaged Japanese forces into their home waters risked transforming victory into disaster if reinforcements arrived or if dawn caught American ships too far north to receive air cover from Henderson Field. Sometimes wisdom required accepting incomplete victory rather than risking defeat through overextension. The seaplane tenders Nishin and Chitos, which had been trailing the Japanese cruiser force, received orders at 0200 hours to scuttle their cargo and return to Shortland. The tender's captains recognized that attempting to deliver supplies to Guadalcanal was now impossible. American forces controlled the approaches. Japanese cruiser escort was damaged and withdrawing, and continuing the mission would simply result in both tenders being sunk. Crew members pushed artillery pieces, ammunition crates, and equipment over the side into deep water, sacrificing the supplies that had been the mission's entire purpose. The 728 soldiers embarked on the tenders would be returned to Shortland rather than delivered to Guadalcanal, meaning the reinforcement mission had failed completely. The material loss was significant, but not devastating. But the strategic failure, proving that American forces could prevent Tokyo Express runs, had implications far beyond the specific cargo scuttled that night. By 0400 hours, the battle was effectively over, though scattered engagements and rescue operations continued. American forces had clearly won a tactical victory. One Japanese heavy cruiser and one destroyer sunk or sinking. 2 additional cruisers heavily damaged, supply mission failed. American losses were also significant. 1 destroyer sunk, 2 cruisers heavily damaged, over 150 casualties, but the exchange ratio favored American forces and, more importantly, the psychological impact of American victory was profound. For the first time since the war began, American surface forces had defeated Japanese ships in night combat. The pattern of defeat that had begun at Savo Island and continued through subsequent engagements had been broken. The United States Navy had proven it could fight at night, could use radar effectively, could coordinate complex formations under combat conditions, could match Japanese tactical expertise with American technology and systematic preparation. The approach of sunrise at 05:45 hours ended the night combat phase and began the damage assessment and recovery phase. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, American search aircraft from Henderson Field took off to locate and track withdrawing Japanese forces. The aircraft found Aoba and Kinugaza limping northwest, both cruisers showing obvious damage and leaving oil slicks. The aircraft attacked with bombs and strafing fire but achieved no additional sinks. Both cruisers would eventually reach Shortland, though requiring months of repair before returning to service. American pilots also photographed the debris field where Duncan and Fubuki had sunk, seeing only wreckage and scattered survivors in the water. The air reconnaissance confirmed what Scott had understood from fragmentary combat reports. American forces had won the battle, but at significant cost. The iron clock that governed night operations in the Solomons had run its course. Darkness had provided the environment where both Japanese expertise and American radar could operate, where torpedo attacks could be launched and evaded, where burning ships illuminated targets for gunfire, where confusion and chaos were inevitable, regardless of planning. But sunrise brought American air superiority, transforming the tactical calculus and providing protection that surface forces alone could not guarantee. The interplay between night combat, where Japanese forces held traditional advantage, and day combat, where American forces dominated through air power, would characterize the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Cape Esperance demonstrated that American forces could now compete in the night phase, narrowing Japanese advantage to the point where American daylight superiority could prove decisive. The clock had ticked through darkness to dawn, and with dawn came the realization that the balance of naval power in the South Pacific was shifting in ways that would determine the war's eventual outcome. And Admiral Chester Nimitz at CINCPAC headquarters in Pearl Harbor received the initial after-action reports from Cape Esperance on October 13, 1942, reading the radio messages with a mixture of satisfaction and concern that reflected both the victory's significance and its incompleteness. The reports indicated 1 Japanese heavy cruiser sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 2 cruisers heavily damaged, and supplies prevented from reaching Guadalcanal, a clear tactical success. But American losses included 1 destroyer sunk with heavy casualties, 2 cruisers requiring extensive repairs, and friendly fire incidents that had damaged American ships and complicated the battle's execution. Nimitz understood that Cape Esperance was a positive development, the first American night surface victory of the war, but he also recognized that the execution had been flawed and that subsequent battles would require improvements to tactics, communications, and coordination that Scott's force had struggled to maintain. The intelligence effort to determine actual Japanese losses began immediately and would continue for weeks as various information sources were analyzed and correlated. Initial American claims were inflated, as was typical for combat reports generated in darkness and confusion. Some American commanders reported sinking 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, claims based on observations of burning ships and explosions that seemed consistent with sinking. But careful analysis of Japanese radio traffic, that submarine reports of damaged Japanese ships returning to port, and post-battle aerial reconnaissance gradually clarified the actual results. One heavy cruiser, Furutaka, had sunk approximately 20 miles northwest of Savo Island, settling to the seafloor in the early morning hours of October 12th. One destroyer, Fubuki, had sunk in the battle area with heavy loss of life. 2 heavy cruisers, Aoba and Kinugasa, had suffered severe damage requiring dry dock repairs lasting several months. These were significant results, but not the crushing victory that initial reports suggested. Japanese intelligence assessment of the battle reached very different conclusions initially, demonstrating how both sides tended to overclaim results when visibility was poor and confusion high. Japanese commanders reported sinking 2 American cruisers and 2 destroyers, claims based on observed fires and explosions aboard American ships that Japanese observers interpreted as catastrophic damage. The claims were not dishonest fabrication. They were honest misinterpretation of observations made in darkness, under stress. Only after several days, when American radio traffic and reconnaissance reports made clear that American forces had not lost 2 cruisers, did Japanese intelligence revise their assessment. The pattern of mutual overclaiming was characteristic of night surface combat throughout the war, where limited visibility and confirmation bias led both sides to believe they had inflicted more damage than was actually achieved. The casualty counts from Cape Esperance, when finally compiled with reasonable accuracy, he told a sobering story about night combat's brutality. American forces lost 195 killed aboard USS Duncan, 107 killed aboard USS Boise, and additional casualties on other ships, totaling approximately 330 killed in action, with similar numbers wounded. Japanese forces lost approximately 654 killed, the majority aboard Furutaka and Fubuki, but with significant casualties on Aoba as well. The casualty exchange ratio favored American forces in absolute numbers, but the human cost on both sides was severe. For every ship damaged or sunk, there were families receiving telegrams, communities mourning losses, and survivors carrying physical and psychological scars that would last lifetimes. The strategic outcome of Cape Esperance extended beyond the specific ships damaged or sunk to the broader context of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces had failed to deliver 728 soldiers and artillery pieces to Guadalcanal, a failure that postponed planned offensives against Henderson Field. American forces had demonstrated capability to intercept Tokyo Express runs, forcing Japanese planners to reconsider assumptions about unopposed nighttime supply operations. The psychological impact on both navies was significant. American morale improved measurably as news spread that United States forces could win night surface engagements, while Japanese confidence in their invincibility at night was shaken. These intangible effects were difficult to quantify, but influenced subsequent operations and decision-making on both sides. The morale boost Cape Esperance provided to American forces in the South Pacific was immediate and substantial. Sailors who had endured Savo Island's humiliation and subsequent defeats in night actions finally had a victory to reference, proof that American forces could compete against Japanese night fighting expertise. Admiral Gormley, whose pessimism about holding Guadalcanal had troubled Nimitz, sent congratulatory messages to Scott and Task Force 64, though privately Gormley remained concerned about whether one victory could reverse the overall trend of Japanese pressure. The Marines on Guadalcanal, who depended on the Navy to prevent Japanese reinforcement, and celebrated the news that a supply convoy had been turned back. The broader American public, when news of the victory was released through Navy Department announcements, responded with enthusiasm that reflected desperate need for good news from the Pacific Theater. The Navy Department's press release about Cape Esperance, issued in late October 1942, exemplified how military victories were presented to sustain public morale while avoiding details that might compromise operational security or reveal tactical failures. The release announced that American forces had won a decisive victory, sinking multiple Japanese ships and preventing enemy reinforcement of Guadalcanal. the specific ships sunk were identified, though the counts were somewhat inflated, and Admiral Scott was praised for tactical brilliance. And what the press release did not mention were the friendly fire incidents, the confusion in formation discipline, USS Duncan's unauthorized charge and subsequent destruction, or the near-catastrophic damage to USS Boise's magazines. These details remained classified, known only to participants and to officers studying after-action reports for tactical lessons. Public presentation emphasized triumph. Professional assessment acknowledged flaws that required correction. The post-battle analysis conducted by Naval War College staff and by operational commanders identified specific problems requiring doctrinal and technical solutions. Communication failures needed to be addressed through better radio procedures, improved TBS equipment, and more realistic training about maintaining formation discipline when visual contact was limited. The friendly fire incidents demonstrated need for better identification procedures, though technical solutions like IFF, identification friend or foe, were still in development. The magazine vulnerability that nearly destroyed Boise prompted Bureau of Ships to review cruiser designs and recommend modifications to magazine arrangements and armor protection. Radar integration procedures needed formalization, with clear doctrine about how radar contacts should be reported and how commanders should use radar information in tactical decision-making. Each lesson identified was a step toward improving American night fighting capability, translating Cape Esperance's experience into systemic improvements. Admiral Scott's personal assessment of the battle, conveyed in private correspondence to Admiral Nimitz, and reflected the thoughtful analysis that characterized his approach to naval operations. Scott acknowledged that Task Force 64 had won, despite imperfect execution, rather than because of flawless performance. He identified communication breakdowns, destroyer discipline failures, and his own hesitation during the critical minutes after radar contact as areas requiring improvement. Scott's willingness to critically examine his own performance, even in victory, demonstrated the intellectual honesty that made him effective as a tactician and teacher. The assessment was not self-flagellation. It was professional recognition that winning a battle did not mean every decision had been optimal and that future victories would require learning from mistakes as well as successes. The comparison between Cape Esperance and Savo Island, the two major night surface actions in the Solomons to date, illuminated how much American capability had improved in just 2 months. At Savo Island, American forces had been surprised, outmaneuvered, and devastated, losing 4 cruisers in 32 minutes without sinking a single Japanese ship. At Cape Esperance, American forces achieved surprise, maneuvered into favorable position, and inflicted more damage than they received, demonstrating that systematic preparation and technological advantage could overcome Japanese tactical expertise. The improvement was not total. American execution remained imperfect, and Japanese forces had inflicted serious damage despite being surprised. But the trajectory was positive, showing that American forces were learning, adapting, and developing the capability to compete in night surface warfare that had seemed almost impossible after Savo Island. Counting the cost of Cape Esperance required acknowledging both the ships and lives lost, and the progress made toward eventual victory in a campaign that would continue for months. The conference rooms at Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, received after-action reports from Cape Esperance in late October 1942, and staff officers immediately recognized that the battle provided case study material rich with tactical lessons. The college's mission was to analyze combat operations, extract principles that could improve future performance, and disseminate findings to the fleet through revised doctrine and training guidance. Thus, Cape Esperance offered unusual analytical value because it was both a victory American forces had won and a flawed victory that exposed problems requiring correction. Perfect victories taught less than imperfect ones because only flawed operations revealed systemic weaknesses that needed addressing. The officers tasked with analyzing Cape Esperance approached their work understanding that American lives in future battles might depend on how well they identified problems and developed solutions. Communication failures dominated the initial analysis, recognized as the single greatest contributor to friendly fire incidents and formation discipline breakdown. The TBS radio system, while superior to signal flags or searchlight communication, had proven inadequate for the complexity of commands required in night surface combat. Messages had been misunderstood, some ships had not received critical orders, and the brevity required for tactical radio communication had created ambiguity about intentions and timing. Naval War College staff recommended developing standardized tactical voice procedures that would reduce misunderstanding, improving TBS equipment to enhance reliability and clarity, and training radio operators specifically for combat communication rather than general maritime radio procedures. The recommendations were detailed and specific, based on careful analysis of which messages had been misunderstood and why. Formation discipline emerged as another critical area requiring doctrinal revision. Scott's single-column formation had theoretical advantages for coordinating fire and maintaining control, but it had proven fragile when subjected to the stress of combat and communication failures. Destroyers had broken formation, creating the friendly fire situations that damaged American ships and destroyed USS Duncan. The War College analysis suggested that future formations needed to be more flexible, allowing individual initiative within bounds that prevented dangerous independence. The challenge was balancing the need for centralized control, essential for coordinating radar information and fire distribution, against the reality that communication limitations made absolute central control impossible in combat. The recommended solution was tiered command structure, where destroyer squadron leaders had authority to maneuver their divisions, while cruiser divisions maintained tighter control, creating flexibility without chaos. The Boise Magazine fire highlighted ship design vulnerabilities that Bureau of Ships needed to address through both retrofit modifications and new construction design changes. The proximity of powder magazines to turret handling rooms, combined with relatively thin deck armor over magazines, created catastrophic vulnerability to penetrating hits. Bureau of Ships analysis determined that relocating magazines away from direct paths between turrets and handling rooms would reduce flash fire risk, that improved magazine subdivision would limit fire propagation even if one magazine ignited, and that the thicker deck armor, while adding weight, was justified by reduced vulnerability. The design changes were expensive and complex, requiring significant modification to existing ships and fundamental redesign of new construction. But the alternative was accepting that American cruisers remained vulnerable to magazine explosions that could destroy ships and kill hundreds of men with single hits. Radar integration doctrine received perhaps the most comprehensive revision based on Cape Esperance experience. Captain Hoover aboard Helena had demonstrated that radar, properly used, could provide decisive advantage in night combat. But the battle had also shown that most officers did not fully understand how to use radar information tactically, that ships without radar felt excluded from the tactical picture, and that coordination between radar-equipped and non-radar-equipped ships was problematic. The doctrinal solution developed was formalization of combat information centers as distinct command spaces, where radar officers had authority to direct ship maneuvering based on radar information. CIC officers would be specially trained in radar interpretation and tactical decision-making, would have direct communication links to the bridge and gunnery control, and would be responsible for maintaining the tactical picture and recommending maneuvers. This represented significant cultural change in the Navy, creating a class of officers whose authority derived from technical expertise rather than traditional seamanship or gunnery experience. Training requirements revision was perhaps the most far-reaching recommendation to emerge from Cape Esperance analysis. The Naval War College determined that existing night combat training was inadequate both in duration and realism. The recommendation was that all cruiser and destroyer divisions should conduct minimum 40 hours monthly of night combat drills, including live fire exercises, formation maneuvering in darkness, radar operator training integrated with tactical scenarios, and communication drills that stressed radio procedures under conditions approximating combat confusion. The training regime Scott had imposed on Task Force 64 needed to become fleet-wide standard rather than the exception. This recommendation had significant resource implications. fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, maintenance requirements, Aoba and crew fatigue all increased with intensive training. But the War College argued that the alternative was continuing to pay the learning costs in combat casualties rather than training investment. The analysis of individual ship performance revealed patterns that had implications for personnel selection and training. Ships with experienced captains who trusted their subordinates and had established clear delegation patterns performed better than ships where captains tried to directly control every detail. Gun crews that had trained together extensively maintained discipline and firing rates even under stress, while crews with recent personnel turnover showed degraded performance. Damage control parties that had rehearsed specific casualty scenarios responded more effectively than parties that had only generic training. These findings led to recommendations that the Navy prioritize crew stability, keeping ships' companies together rather than constantly transferring personnel, that specialized training be established for damage control, gunnery, and radar operation, and that captain selection criteria include not just technical competence but also ability to delegate and trust subordinates. The friendly fire problem received special attention because it had damaged American ships and created confusion that degraded American tactical effectiveness. Analysis determined that visual identification of ships at night was extremely difficult regardless of training, that destroyers and cruisers could appear similar in silhouette depending on angle and distance, and that stressed observers tended to see what they expected rather than what was actually present. The technical solution being developed was IFF equipment that could electronically distinguish friendly from enemy ships, but this technology was not yet available for fleet deployment. Interim procedural solutions included designating specific zones where destroyers would operate, requiring destroyers to report their positions continuously, and training gun crews to verify targets visually before firing. None of these solutions was perfect, but collectively they reduced friendly fire risk compared to the ad hoc procedures that had proven inadequate at Cape Esperance. The comparison between American and Japanese night fighting capabilities after Cape Esperance showed that the gap had narrowed but not disappeared. Japanese forces still possessed superior optical equipment, more experienced night combat crews, Aoba and superior torpedoes with longer range and larger warheads. American forces now possess superior radar, improving gunnery training, and growing confidence based on having achieved victory. Future night engagements would likely be close contests where small advantages could prove decisive, rather than the one-sided Japanese victories that had characterized early war battles. This assessment implied that American forces should seek night combat when conditions favored their strengths, radar detection, coordinated gunnery, defensive formations, while avoiding conditions that favored Japanese strengths, close-range torpedo melees, independent destroyer actions, offensive charges into prepared defenses. The institutional response to Cape Esperance lessons varied across different Navy departments and commands. Some recommendations were implemented rapidly. Communication procedures were revised within weeks. CIC doctrine was distributed to the fleet by early December. Training requirements were increased immediately for units preparing for South Pacific deployment. Other recommendations required months or years to implement. Ship design changes needed to go through engineering review and construction scheduling, radar equipment production needed to expand to equip more ships, and cultural changes in how officers viewed technical systems versus traditional seamanship could not be imposed by directive alone. The gap between identifying lessons and implementing them fully was inevitable given institutional inertia and resource constraints. But the important point was that the Navy's systems for learning from combat experience were functioning. Cape Esperance became the schoolhouse where American surface forces learned how to fight at night. And the lessons taught at that schoolhouse would save lives in battles yet to come. The night of November 13th, 1942, just 33 days after Cape Esperance, American and Japanese forces met again in the waters off Guadalcanal in what would be called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. A chaotic, brutal engagement that demonstrated both how much American forces had learned and how much they still had to learn. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a cruiser division in the battle, applying the tactical lessons from Cape Esperance with the confidence of previous victory. American forces used radar effectively, maintained better formation discipline than at Cape Esperance, and coordinated fire with improved effectiveness. But Japanese forces, reinforced and determined, fought with devastating skill. At approximately 0150 hours on November 14th, a Japanese battleship shell struck San Francisco's bridge where Scott was directing operations. The shell killed Scott instantly along with most of his command staff. The admiral, who had proven American forces could fight at night, died in night combat. His tactical innovations validated by victory, but unable to save him from the random violence that characterized naval warfare. The contrast between Cape Esperance and the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, illustrated the danger of overconfidence born from limited success. American forces approached Tassafaronga with aggressive confidence, believing they had mastered night combat through their Cape Esperance victory. But Japanese destroyer forces under Rear Admiral Tanaka executed a nearly perfect torpedo attack that damaged 4 American cruisers, Northampton sinking, Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, all suffering severe torpedo damage. American overconfidence had led to tactical complacency, inadequate caution about Japanese torpedo capabilities, and assumptions that radar provided greater advantage than it actually did. Tassafaronga was a harsh reminder that Cape Esperance had been a step forward, but not a complete solution, that Japanese forces remained formidable opponents capable of inflicting devastating defeats even after American tactical improvements. The evolution of American night fighting capability from Cape Esperance through subsequent battles showed gradual improvement punctuated by setbacks that taught additional lessons. By mid-1943, American forces had achieved consistent effectiveness in night surface combat, routinely defeating Japanese forces through superior radar, improved gunnery coordination, and systematic training. The Battle of Columbangara in July 1943 and the Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943 demonstrated American mastery of techniques first attempted at Cape Esperance: radar-directed interceptions, coordinated destroyer torpedo attacks, cruiser gunnery controlled from CIC. But this mastery required 18 months of continuous combat, multiple defeats alongside victories, and institutional willingness to learn from both success and failure. Cape Esperance was the beginning of that learning process, but not its completion. The physical legacy of Cape Esperance lies on the seafloor of Iron Bottom Sound, where USS Duncan and Japanese cruiser Furutaka settled into the mud alongside the earlier casualties from Savo Island. Modern shipwreck diving expeditions have located both vessels, photographing the deteriorated hulls and documenting how decades of saltwater corrosion have transformed steel warships into artificial reefs colonized by marine life. Duncan lies at approximately 600 feet depth, her hull broken by the force of sinking and subsequent deterioration. Furutaka rests in deeper water, her structure more intact but equally corroded. The wrecks serve as war graves. Japanese and American sailors remain entombed in the ships where they died, and are protected by international maritime law that prohibits salvage or disturbance. The physical remains of the battle are monuments to men who fought and died, reminders that naval combat's abstraction and historical analysis represented concrete reality of burning ships and drowning sailors. The human legacy of Cape Esperance is carried by the survivors who lived with memories of that night for the rest of their lives. Veterans who served aboard Helena spoke with pride about their ship's performance, how radar had provided the advantage that made victory possible, how their gunnery had been accurate and devastating. Survivors from Duncan carried different memories, of confusion and friendly fire, of watching their ship die, of floating in darkness waiting for rescue that might not come. Boise survivors remembered the magazine fire, the incredible heat, the friends who died in flames trying to flood magazines and save the ship. These memories shaped how veterans understood the war, how they explained their service to families, how they processed trauma and loss. Some spoke freely about their experiences. Others maintained silence for decades, unable or unwilling to revisit that night. The psychological legacy was as real as the physical scars many carried. The strategic significance of Cape Esperance in the broader Guadalcanal campaign was meaningful but not decisive. The battle delayed Japanese reinforcement by several weeks, bought time for American forces to strengthen Henderson Field, and demonstrated that Tokyo Express runs could be intercepted. But Japanese forces continued attempting supply runs, some successful and some defeated. And the struggle for Guadalcanal continued until February 1943, when Japanese forces finally evacuated the island. Cape Esperance was one battle in a campaign comprising dozens of engagements, land, sea, and air. And while it contributed to eventual American victory, it did not determine outcome alone. The battle's greatest significance was perhaps psychological rather than material, proving to American forces that they could compete against Japanese night fighting expertise broke a psychological barrier that had constrained American tactical thinking after Savo Island. The tactical innovations Scott developed for Cape Esperance, single-column formations for coordination, radar-directed interceptions, and a systematic training for night operations, became foundation for American night combat doctrine that would be refined and expanded throughout the war. But Scott did not live to see how completely his innovations would be vindicated. His death at the naval battle of Guadalcanal meant he never knew that the tactical principles he had struggled to implement against institutional skepticism would become standard practice. Later, commanders who used those principles to achieve victories credited Scott's pioneering work, but credit came posthumously. The professor of night fighting died still teaching, his final lesson written in the destruction of his flagship's bridge by a battleship shell. The reconciliation between former enemies that characterized post-war relations included Cape Esperance veterans from both sides. In the 1990s, Japanese and American survivors met on Guadalcanal for ceremonies commemorating the battles fought there 50 years earlier. Men who had tried to kill each other in 1942 spoke as elderly veterans, sharing experiences that few others could understand. The meetings were emotionally complex. Respect for former enemies' courage mixed with memories of friends killed, acknowledgement of shared suffering mixed with lingering national pride, awareness of war's futility mixed with conviction that individual service had been honorable. These reunions demonstrated that while wars end, the bonds formed in combat, even bonds between enemies, persist across decades. The analytical verdict on Cape Esperance among naval historians is that it was a significant but flawed victory that demonstrated American capability to compete in night surface combat while exposing persistent weaknesses in execution. The battle is studied at naval war colleges as case study in how technological advantage, radar, can be degraded by communication failures and tactical confusion. It illustrates the challenge of coordinating complex operations in darkness with limited visibility and primitive radio equipment. It demonstrates that training and systematic preparation can partially compensate for experience disadvantages, and it shows how friendly fire and command control breakdown can undermine even successful operations. But these lessons remain relevant to modern naval operations, where technology has advanced but fundamental challenges of coordination, communication, and decision-making under uncertainty persist. The debt owed to men who fought at Cape Esperance, American and Japanese, survivors and those who died, is the obligation to remember accurately, to honor without glorifying, to learn without sentimentalizing. The battle was neither the turning point some contemporary accounts claimed, nor an insignificant skirmish that some later analyses have suggested. It was one step in a long, brutal campaign where thousands died pursuing strategic objectives that would eventually be achieved at tremendous cost. The ships at Iron Bottom Sound carry that debt in their corroded hulls. The survivors who carried memories until they died carried that debt in their minds. Historians who study the battle carry that debt in the obligation to present truth rather than myth. Cape Esperance was not the moment American naval forces became dominant in the Pacific. That dominance would require years more combat and sacrifice. But it was the moment when American forces proved they could fight at night, could adapt and learn, could pay the tuition required to eventually prevail. The iron bottom of Guadalcanal Sound holds the receipts for that tuition, paid in ships and lives by men who fought when victory was uncertain and survival was not guaranteed.